experts from various organizations, and I have been very happy to work together with all of you, and the results are seen in this report, and I'm very pleased with the outcome of the work. And this is not going to be the end of the world, end of our work. We have agreed with the government of Chile that this process is also feeding into the COP25 process, and we are happy to have a professor from Chile, Maisa, with us, and she's chairing the scientific advisory group of COP25. And a week ago, I had a chance to discuss with the minister in UK, who is in charge of the COP26, and they would also be happy to get input from our side. So with these words, once again, welcome and enjoy the scientific intelligence for the coming 3 hours. Thank you.
Thank you, Petri, and let me join you in extending a very warm welcome to all of you to this event that we are organizing. I think we are all living in this era of rapid change that is taking place, and the demand that there is for all stakeholders to come together and act in collaboration in order to be able to respond. I think this is a great initiative where the science community, in a sense, is coming together to see if we can have a more unified and triangulated set of messages that we can give to the policy community so that they may act according to that and work with it. So what we have seen, I think, coming out from the exercises that we have been doing over the last several months is that there is an alarming increase in the frequency and intensity of the range of extreme events that are taking place. And I think that highlights to some extent the inherent conservative nature of science and the predictions that we have been making. And I think policymakers need to take cognizance of the fact that when science reports do come out, they are generally conservative, and we need to be worrying possibly a lot more and acting with a much greater degree of urgency. But having said that, I think it's also to be recognized that science publications, there's been a growing number of sophisticated analysis of very complex interactive systems with feedback loops, and this has enhanced our understanding of why climate is hitting us earlier and harder, as Petri just mentioned, than what we expected. So this event is marking, as again Petri has said, the start of something, not the end, and I think this work will be continuing over a period of time. United in Science, the document that you're seeing in front of you and our effort so far has been a short gestation effort over the last few months only, and yet it has been inclusive, in bringing together a number of partners and hopefully more going forward as we approach COP25 and go beyond that. A particular refrain we saw in a number of documents that needs to be highlighted is the fact that there are going to be differential impacts and vulnerabilities of different populations and regions and ecosystems that are facing multiple stressors, and that I think is something that, again, we need to be cognizant of and need to be able to take on board. There are several examples of how these differential impacts are going to affect different communities. I won't go into the details of this. You will be hearing more about it as we go along. There's also a great degree of consensus that is emerged already that we need to have systemic transformations that are taking place if we are to address the problem of climate change, and not just on the mitigation side, but I think there's also a call to do a lot more on the adaptation side as well, which again needs to be transformational. So these are all things that have been highlighted, and over the course of the day, I'm sure you will hear a lot more about this. So welcome once again.
Okay, and we are very happy to have high-level opening speakers here. And first, I would like to give the floor to Minister Andres Correa, and he's the Minister of Science and Technology and Innovation of Government of Chile, and of course you are the host country of COP25, and you will be playing an important role, and we'll be most happy to hear from you your thoughts. Please.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the co-chairs for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak at this session. I think I don't have to remind you that regarding climate change, it is really time for action. At the recently created Ministry of Science in Chile, we've been in office for 9 months. I came directly from academia. I've been a neuroscientist all my life, so I come from science, but I'm now in politics. We take time for action seriously. So we're encouraging a very first step in terms of time for action, and that very first step is to strongly embrace the compelling evidence produced by the international scientific community. We sometimes forget that this is a very important first step in politics, acknowledging and welcoming the compelling information. In our minds, this is a vital issue and one that's worth defending with renovated vigor, as we perceive, despite our conviction, that the relevance of evidence is sometimes fragile in our contemporary world and perhaps not so solidly built as one would like to believe. This is my first message. Acknowledge from the political side the compelling evidence. Second, we realize that fear, with catastrophic and apocalyptic scenarios, only serve to paralyze us. On the contrary, although we are fully convinced of the seriousness of the current evidence and its projections, time for action also means embracing a responsible solution perspective. Solutions where science, technology, and innovation are implemented by integrating academic research, the public sector, the private sector, and civil society. In Chile, we have committed to fully replace coal energy production by 2040, to electromobility in public transport, and to become carbon neutral by 2050. These objectives require new perspective in the upgrading of our NDCs and very strong alliances to turn this into a global effort. In preparing for COP25, we have set up a scientific advisory committee that will produce local reports and will participate in elaborating our NDC. We have incorporated members of our staff in the negotiating teams for COP25 and as delegates for the IPCC sessions. We've had the chance to participate in this panel thanks to the kind invitation and to the dedication of Maisa Rojas, who's here with us from University of Chile. Indeed, I have to say I have witnessed the conviction of hundreds of scientists that are working with us to contribute to make a difference. I really admire their commitment. From our perspective, full consideration of scientific evidence is the opportunity of our time to drive sustainable and integral development. I want to end with 2 considerations. More information leads to more action. Is that true? And I really question that. I think evidence is not enough. Excellent and compelling reports like the ones discussed today or the IPCC are unfortunately not enough. We need to find more effective ways in which evidence finds its way to public policy. We need to make additional efforts to make a bridge between the evidence and the public policy. I think this is the challenge that we're facing today. We need to do that with political institutions that understand how to incorporate evidence in decision-making. And perhaps we need to really start by communicating these findings to the public, because the public at the end is going to demand the solutions. And finally, I think there's 2 words that usually come into the discussions when we talk about climate change. One of them is environment, the environment, and the other one is costs. And we are talking about those 2 things. We're talking about the environment and we're talking about costs. And I think we should change it to talk about development and opportunities. The only way forward will be to convince public and private actors to step into climate action because it's part of development, it's part of a sustainable development, and it's part of the opportunities that science and technology brings us. And one final consideration is that we really need to take into account the losers. How are we going to compensate? How are we going to provide incentives for them to migrate to opportunities that lead to sustainable development? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Minister, for the words of wisdom, and we also appreciate that you were coming directly from Monaco, from the IPCC Ocean Report events, and that's showing your commitment to science. So I think that was a good sign. The next speaker is Minister Krista Mikkonen. She's the new Minister of Environment and Energy and Climate Change in Finland, and the new government of Finland is having very ambitious climate program, and they are also having the presidency of the European Union at the moment, and European Union has been world leader in climate mitigation, and they are at the moment preparing very ambitious program also there. So you are playing very important role. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. Excellencies, scientists, distinguished guests, thank you for organizing this important event, and thank you for your work, especially to you, Petteri, and all the others. Just like the IPCC 1.5 degrees special report last year, this report makes a very timely contribution. It helps us to understand where the world stands in relation to the Paris Agreement goal and what are the solutions at hand. This information will be in a key role when countries start to update their climate commitments. We already know that implementing the current commitments would lead to global warming of over 3 degrees. We also know that it's still possible to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, but this means immediate and scaled-up actions in all sectors. Emissions will need to be halved by 2030 to reach the net zero CO2 emissions globally by around mid-century. I assure you that Finland and the EU are at the forefront of strengthening global response to climate change in the framework of the Paris Agreement. Scientific understanding of climate change has informed the founding and development of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement also signals the need for use the best available science in its implementation. Today's report is yet another remarkable effort of scientists to inform policymakers worldwide and society at large. It's important that such a large coalition of organizations and scientists have united to write this report together. I want to thank the WMO and all the Science Advisory Group for their understanding work in delivering this report. Science continues to give us answers, and they are clear. Limiting climate change to 1.5 degrees is necessary to avoid the worst impacts and reduce the likelihood of extreme weather events. The impacts of global warming are already transforming our environment. We already see trend changes in the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. We must work together to address those challenges. And all parties must step up efforts from the pledges made under the Paris Agreement. Saving our planet Earth is our #1 mission. Research and innovation play a crucial role in our efforts to tackle climate change. They are also crucial for turning today's challenges into opportunities. We need a change. We need it in energy, transport, manufacturing, and all other sectors. And we need it now. Thank you.
Thank you, Krista. And then we will turn to UNESCO, our education and science organization, and we are happy to welcome the fairly newly appointed Assistant Director General Samila Nair Beduel to speak on behalf of my colleague Audrey Azoulay. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Tallis. Excellencies, good morning to all of you. And thank you for giving UNESCO the opportunity to present just an overview this morning and perhaps have a chance to discuss later on as well. So on behalf of the Director General of UNESCO, thank you for bringing us here to this platform. And as we discussed earlier on, it's a pity that we had not been much more engaged in the science for sustainable development as per the mandate of UNESCO. I'd like to highlight here that the entire science program of UNESCO is built around the implementation of the 2030 agenda. And this calls for very strong science, technology, and innovation systems in all of the 193 member states. But this also calls for evidence-based policy development and program implementation. To address the climate change and mitigate its adverse effects, UNESCO's role is to provide up-to-date scientific knowledge with its partners that meets the highest standards of impartiality, rigor, ethics, and transparency. And through this knowledge and the strengthening of the links between science and policy, we do believe that countries will be in a better position to take the appropriate decisions and develop relevant long-term strategies. The cooperation that UNESCO provides to developing countries is really in accordance with the principles of solidarity and equity and strengthening international scientific collaboration. We have heard here how we need to bring together different types of expertise in the environmental science and climate science. And just very briefly, the programs of UNESCO are developed around the needs of its member states. And UNESCO is home to a number of different intergovernmental and international scientific programs. One of them is called the Intergovernmental Hydrology Program, which is responsible for transformative water actions with 169 intergovernmental hydrology program committees in 169 countries. These committees are responsible to better tackle the dynamics and forms of water resource governance and management. We also are home to the only intergovernmental international program on geoscience and geoparks. After all, how could we manage our Earth systems without understanding the geology of our Earth systems? And this program we would like to make available to all the other countries and governments of the world. UNESCO is also home to the unique Man and Biosphere program. This is really emblematic of UNESCO's interdisciplinary approach. The biosphere reserves, and I'd like to call upon all of you to have copies of this. This World Network of Biosphere Reserves covers 124 countries in 701 sites. And these are unique laboratories of learning, where for the first time you see innovative ideas for sustainable development, and we'll present these later, on how science, the different forms of science are coming together to meet the needs of countries. And these are laboratories of learning, where the different disciplines of science, technology, innovation, social science, traditional knowledge comes to play. UNESCO is also home to the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. It's the only commission to monitor the seas, and it's at the forefront of research on mitigating the effects of climate change through conservation and restoration of coastal and marine ecosystems, such as mangroves, salt marshes, which can actually store the CO2 in large quantities known as blue carbon. So we are delighted to be part of this initiative. We'd like to thank you for inviting us, and hopefully we can go into a few more details later on in the program and how we at UNESCO would like to offer this as really the platform for dialogue and exchange for international scientific collaboration that is in line with international rules for ethics of international solidarity as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Samila. And finally, I would like to give floor to Professor Paul Watkinson, and he's chair of Substance. Substance is the interface between science community and the climate negotiation process, and you are playing critical role, and we are also happy to have the previous chair of Substa the former PR of WMO at Belize with us here. So, but I'd like to give the floor to you, Professor Watkinson, please.
Many thanks and good morning, and thank you for this opportunity to say a few words as you launch this extremely valuable report. I should say thank you for promoting me to a professor. I'm not, but I'd be very nice to be. But I recognize the skills and the expertise of many in this room, and I think the question is, how do we in the policy community work with the scientific community and the work that you are giving us, and how do we discuss that together? That's the role of SUBSTA, the subsidiary body for scientific and technological advice under the Climate Convention. It is, as you say, an interface between our two communities, multiple communities, I would add. I think it's it's not as simple as just one and another. So I think bringing that together, and science underpins very much the work we have to undertake on climate change. And it has been very much a critical part of the role of SUBSTA over the years to help us to understand that better, and also to dialogue back and explain some of the things that we from the policy community need from the scientific community as we develop and strengthen action. And I think we're at a stage now where the strengthening of action, implementation, and of course ambition is at the very heart of the discussions here in New York. They will, I know, be at the heart of the discussions in Santiago and all the future, particularly 2020, as we move to revising nationally determined contributions and developing long-term strategies. That is where we need to see how do we put ourselves on track towards the keeping global warming well below 2 degrees or 1.5 degrees, as we said in the Paris Agreement. Those are our politically agreed targets by the global community. Where I welcome very much this report, although it makes for bleak readings at times, as do many discussions on this, since it shows how clearly we are not on track to take us there. We need to look at that clearly. And I think, as the Chilean science minister said, we cannot just simply take it as fear. This is wrong, let's close our eyes and pretend this isn't the case. That won't get us anywhere. It's how do we use this? We've had some complicated discussions in our last few meetings of SUBSTA around the science, particularly when we had the 1.5 degrees report from the IPCC. I think that probably sent some slightly strange messages to the global community as to the way the governments, the international community, the multilateral community relates to science. But I think it shows that we as parties in the Climate Convention under SUBSTA are not there to negotiate the science. The scientific community has worked in line with the scientific method to present us the best available knowledge. And I think in this document, you brought together a range of the different studies. And there are many more which could also be brought in. And I think the way that coordination can be strengthened is very valuable. But for us, what we need to do is to look at that science with clear eyes and use it in our plans, in setting our ambition, and in revising our action to bring it in line with the goals we have set ourselves under the Paris Agreement and, of course, the Convention back in '92. So it's very helpful to have this sort of update, bringing together the synthesis on the state of the climate, greenhouse gas concentrations, emission sources, the state of the science and the state of climate services, bringing all of this information to a coherent storyline, high-level storyline. It helps. It helps us to understand clearly and to put it on the table in a synthetic way. That's always helpful. We know there's a lot underneath which is there. So I welcome it, and I want to thank you for it. Of course, in the next session of SUBSTA in Santiago in December, we will organize an Earth Information Day. I'm organizing that under the guidance of parties, and that will be an opportunity for presenting and discussing many aspects of this synthesis under the work of SUBSTA, since I think it's very relevant. We look what is happening. But I think the other side of this, and this is maybe where we need to work together further, and it links very much into the political discussion going on here in this meeting, and I'm sure in Santiago. What more will we do? And that takes us into the preparation of the revision of our NDCs. It takes us also into the next phase of the work under the Paris Agreement when we move towards the global stocktake in 2023. And the way in which we can organize, and that will be part of the work of Subster also as we move that forward, how can we work with the scientific community to bring the best available science, obviously with the IPCC, but more broadly with other aspects of the international community on science, how can we bring that in so that we see not just where are we, but how we can really make this deep transformation and take advantage of those opportunities in front of us. So thank you once again, and I look forward to joining you for at least part of this morning, although I shall unfortunately have to join other meetings during the course of the day.
Thank you, and I would like to hand over to Lina.
Thank you very much, Petri, and thank you all for your interventions. With that, we will move to the second part of our event this morning, and would like to start by presenting some of the key messages that we have in the report, some of which have already been alluded to by various speakers. Just as a quick recap, we are a fairly small science advisory group, and we were tasked to respond to this need for a coherent and concise messaging from the science community. And at this point, I would like to acknowledge all the partners that contributed to this particular publication that we have, United in Science, and they all did so at very short notice. And we really did appreciate the inputs that were provided by all of them. We hope that this publication will serve to provide a better understanding of where we are with science in terms of some of the latest developments that have taken place. And of course, the key messages that we have in here will be better illustrated by the speakers that are going to follow in this particular session. As a basis for the discussions that we're having today, of course, is the Paris Agreement, which was a landmark agreement, which we are all very familiar with. I don't need to go into the details of that. But following the Paris Agreement, of course, was the 1.5 degrees Celsius report that came out, and that's recognized that we could significantly reduce the risks and impacts of climate change, and that every bit of warming matters. I think that was a critical conclusion from this report, that every bit of warming matters. We don't necessarily have to give up because we are not achieving a particular target. And that limiting temperature to 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial levels would have clear benefits and would go hand in hand with reaching other world goals, such as achieving sustainable development and eradicating poverty. Yet another report of the IPCC had also highlighted the fact that climate change puts additional pressure on land and its ability to support and supply food, water, health, and well-being. So once again, stressing the importance of the linkages between climate change and several of the sustainable development goals that we have. Having said that, I think it has been recognized in almost all the reports and the submissions that have already been made here that implementing the current unconditional NDCs would lead to a global mean temperature rise of between 2.9 and 3.4 degrees Celsius. We would, by 2100, we would be nowhere close to staying within the 2 degrees Celsius guardrail, or indeed the hope of reaching only 1.5 degrees. The current level of NDC ambition needs to be roughly tripled for emissions reductions to be in line with 2 degrees Celsius, and increased fivefold for the 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. So there's obviously an enormous amount of work that needs to be done. But at the same time, I think there is a recognition that it is still possible to bridge the gaps that exist between where we need to be and where we are today in terms of our commitments. Of great concern is the fact that despite the fact that we have experienced extraordinary growth in renewable energy, fossil fuels still dominate the global energy system. Carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuel use continue to grow by over 1% annually, and in 2018 we reached a new high of 2%. Growth of these coal emissions resumed in 2017. In a sense, I think what we are saying is global emissions are not estimated to peak even by 2030, leave alone the call to peak emissions by 2020. And the growing climate impacts increase the risk of crossing critical tipping points in the Earth systems. The critical role of cities in reducing emissions locally and globally has also been emphasized in many reports, as well as the vulnerability of cities to climate impacts. Cities consume about 78% of the world's energy and produce more than 60% of all carbon dioxide emissions. So they are a very critical player in this effort. From all that has been said in the various reports and the summary that has been provided, it is obvious that climate and early warning information services should underpin decision-making on climate action for adaptation. However, the capacities of countries to deliver climate and early warning information services varies across regions and speaks once again to the point of different capacities and vulnerabilities. I think there is an important caveat that has also been provided by a linked report, which is the IPBES, which recognizes the fact that natural CO2 sinks exist in the form of forests and oceans and so on, but that we need to be careful about how we use these sinks and then the response measures that we are trying to put in place, because large-scale deployment of bioenergy plantations and afforestation of non-forest ecosystems can come with negative side effects. So in the same as in the case of mitigation, I think in the case of adaptation as well, context matters is a message that I think comes out clearly in various reports. There are other parts to the key messages. I will request Petri to add to those and then also talk in some detail about the work of the WMO in this area. Petri, over to you.
Thank you, Lina, and I have understood that my colleague from UNEP is having some pressure on his calendar and her calendar, and so I would like to give floor to her first. In my family, the ladies usually have the first and the last word. So
first and last word. Well,
so
look, Petri.
Inger,
thank you, Petri, and I'm so sorry. It's incredibly packed, and this is actually one of their most important sessions, but I'm bookended. So. First of all, let me just say that we are incredibly pleased to be part of this United in Science publication that Petri and the team took the initiative to put together. Bravo to you. Thank you. Now, what you know is that each year UNEP puts together the emissions gap report, and we've been doing that for 10 years, or actually from way back to the Copenhagen Accord and the Cancun agreements. And so over this decade where we have seen the emissions gap report issued, it has really provided a very clear-eyed insight into where we are and the trajectory that we are on. This year we published the 10th edition, but in addition to that, we are also publishing a 10-year summary of what we have learned. And allow me just to give you a little bit of a synopsis of what it is that we have learned over these 10 years and what we now understand. The first point is essentially, I'm sorry to say, but it very much echoes what Professor Watkinson was saying, is that we have a lost decade. We have a lost decade because there has been not the action that we said we were going to do. Essentially, as we all know, we're heading towards a 3.5 degree temperature, and we see that that is, well, if we are going to get to the 1.5 or the 2, well, that is slipping away. And so this sounds quite familiar. We've been repeating it quite a lot, but we are very clear that unless we now look at impacts, as we look at impacts, we're seeing 4.5 billion people affected by disasters during 98 and 2017, and 96% of these were climate related. Now, the second lesson is that some progress has been made, yes. In fact, we could argue that the G20s, the nations, amongst others, are collectively on course to meet the Cancun commitments. And we can see that the explosion in renewables is very good. We all know this. And an estimated 2 billion tons of carbon dioxide emissions have been avoided in 2017. But the 10-year review makes it also clear that the scientific understanding of the consequences of inaction and the available options for rapid and cost-effective emission reductions have improved significantly. So it's clear that we may not have affected the headline emission figures, but we are in a far better place than where we were when we started out. That's sort of a sorry conclusion, but nevertheless the best that we can see from the emissions gap report. The third lesson is that we could still hit those targets. If we look at technologies, if we look at what technology offers us, we know this from solar and wind, efficient appliances, efficient cars, afforestation, and stopping deforestation. All of these are part and parcel of the solution, and everyone in this room is very clear on it. But bridging that emissions gap that our report has shown over that 10-year period will require full utilization of the entire tool of instruments that we have in our box. And that will require the science policy interface, if you like, that the science journeys into policy and journeys into business and decisions that we take in our production and consumption patterns so that we can sustain the Earth system. And the fourth lesson is obviously that it will take everyone to meet those targets. And so today, for example, we are launching the principles of responsible banking. So we need to get the finance sector in there. We need to get the agriculture sector in there. We need to get the business sector in there. And we need to obviously get the energy sector in there and innovation and clearly the land sector. But maybe the final lesson is that the scientific rigor has been and will remain absolutely critical to climate action. I liked very much what you said, that we are not here to negotiate the science. The science speaks. We are here to take that science and to fold that into policies. We are here to take that science and fold it into action. We are here to take that science and make it understood by the woman and man the children have already understood in the streets. And that's the work that we, together with our friends at WMO and with IPCC and with everyone in the science community, are set to do. So for us, having this report now is very important. We can see the 10-year track record. We do observe that what we projected 10 years ago as a no-action scenario is actually where we are in 2020. So that was UNEP's prediction on the first emissions gap report, which is dire. But at the same time, we can see that renewables have made that significant splash on the market and that the options and the prices are such that it is now a highly competitive option. Plus, of course, the understanding that nature-based solutions will be critical for us in the decarbonization period to hit our targets whilst we protect our standing forests. And so finally, maybe just to say that from UNEP's side, we see the three conventions: desertification that deals with land degradation and prevention of productive land use, biodiversity, which deals with ensuring that ecosystems and ecosystem services and the associated species are there, and climate change. We see those three, plus many other conventions, but I won't go into that, holding these three Rio conventions really become the solutions pathway that we need to ensure to get to what Johan has called our planetary boundaries, sustainability, and living within the Earth system's balance. So with that, let me thank Petri for allowing me to go first. And very much a warm thanks to everyone for the work that the science community is providing for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Inger, and thanks for keeping the time as well. So that was a good example for all of us. So now I'm trying to keep my time. So I will summarize what has been our contribution and how we see this climate challenge. Next, please. So at WMO we are dealing with weather, climate, and water issues, and we are also hosting IPCC Secretariat, and we are the founding father of IPCC. We realized in our first climate conference in '79 that climate change is and will be an important issue for the welfare of the mankind, and that's why we established IPCC, and we have been happy to have partner UNEP playing a role also there. And we are also very much playing a role with the United Nations Secretary General, and I'm one of the climate principals of giving guidance to him in his climate interventions. Next, please. First, what we know about greenhouse gases, we have been able to drill the Antarctic and the Greenland ice cores and see how the concentrations of three main greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and N2O concentrations have varied, and during the past 100 years we have seen quite unusual concentrations, and we have far exceeded natural variability. Next, please. And we have been breaking records in those concentrations also year by year, and also during the past year we have seen an increase in carbon dioxide, methane, and N2O concentrations, and out of those, carbon dioxide is clearly a key issue. It has contributed 2/3 of the warming so far, methane 17%, and the nice thing with methane is that its lifetime is only 12 years, so that's a problem that we could solve in a speedier manner as compared to the carbon dioxide problem. And N2O has contributed to 6% of the warming. And this is what the centers in the world, and we have been happy to see also Europeans joining this enterprise, especially European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasts, and we are happy to have the director with us today. And so far we have reached 1.1 degree warming, and last July was the warmest single month during this period, and last June was warmest June recorded since 1850s. Next, please. And the warming has especially been taking place at the high northern latitudes. We have seen an anomaly south of Greenland, which is related to the ocean current changes most likely. And if you look at the summer case, you can see that the Mediterranean region has been perhaps number 2 in this warming. And all in all, we have seen more warming over the continents as compared to the oceans. Next, please. And that means that this is from World Health Organization. They have estimated that we have a growing amount of people who are exposed to heat waves, and we have also been facing growing amount of casualties related to these heat waves, also hitting European countries. Next, please. And here are some heat wave examples. We have seen heat waves in Europe both this year and last year, also in Australia during the past 2 years. There was severe heat wave hitting India and Pakistan, and there the conditions for human beings have been even more difficult because the countries are not able to provide such facilities as the European countries. And also Japan was facing severe heat waves, especially last July. Next, please. And we have stored more than 90% of the excess heat to oceans, and this heat is also giving more energy for tropical storms, and we have seen also tropical storms in wider areas than before, and one of them was Cyclone Idai, which was hitting Mozambique, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. Next, please. And actually, the thing that may have had the bigger impact on human beings has been the changes in precipitation patterns. And here we have a comparison of 2 periods of rainfall, and you can see that Africa and Southern Asia, for example, have been getting drier, and in general we have seen more rainfall at the high latitudes, especially in northern hemisphere. Next, please. And IMF estimated in our Status of Climate report a year ago what has been the economic impact of this 1 degree warming, and you can see that there has already been a negative impact in whole southern hemisphere and low latitudes of northern hemisphere, and only the high northern latitudes have benefited because of higher temperatures and more precipitation. Next, please. And our colleagues at the FAO have estimated that we have seen a growth in undernourishment, and that's a consequence of both this drought and higher temperatures. Next, please. We have seen melting of the mountain glaciers, and we are following 31 of those, and you can see that this negative trend has been boosted during the last 20 years. Next, please. Next. And major changes we have seen in the Arctic. We have melted 75% of the sea ice mass there, and we have practically melted all of the multi-year ice. We have mostly 1-year-old ice left in the region. Next, please. And sea level rise estimates. This is from the U.S. science report that was published last year, and they estimated that there's a potential for higher sea level rise estimates by the end of this century, and that's very much related to the speedier melting of Greenland and Antarctic ice. Next, please. And here are some estimates which are the factors behind the current sea level rise. It used to be very much driven by the thermal expansion, which is still important, but there's a growing component coming from Greenland, which we have seen tripling of the melting speed, and also the Antarctic melting has begun, and those are the key factors where we expect to see a boost in the coming decades, and that's why some of these sea level rise estimates were much higher than before. Next, please. And then finally, a few words about the carbon question. Inger was touching that a bit, but here's the big picture. What are the sources and sinks of carbon? And you can see that fossil carbon is clearly dominating the picture. Land use change is important, but that's not the biggest factor here. And we have sinks to the oceans, and we have seen acidification of the seawater already, and land sink is important, and there's growing amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Next, please. And you know who are the emitters, and classically it's Europe and USA. China has become #1 emitter, but there has been also fairly rapid growth in the non-OECD countries' emissions. So this is demonstrating that the solutions also have to be global. Next, please. And this is from International Energy Agency. There has been a growth in energy demand, and last year we were comforting the demand, especially by enhancing the amount of gas, renewables, oil, but also coal-fired energy was built both in China and some developing countries. Next, please. And finally, this is from the IPCC report showing what needs to be done if we would like to reach 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees, and it's a challenge for the coming 5 years to bend the curve if we would like to reach 1.5 degrees, and then we have 15 years if we would like to reach 2 degrees to bend the curve. And if we don't do anything, we would reach 3 to 5 degrees by the end of this century, and if we use all of the fossil fuel resources, we would reach 8 degrees warming. Next, please. And in the Arctic, you can double all of these numbers on annual average and triple when it comes to winter temperatures. So anyhow, we will see major changes there. And finally, what needs to happen? Next, please. Okay, there was still one on Arctic. These Arctic changes have had an impact on atmospheric dynamics more widely, and some of these stagnant winter and summer conditions, they are related to changes in the Arctic and global dynamics. Next, please. And this is the big challenge that we are facing now. We are producing 85% of the global energy based on fossil sources, and only 15% based on nuclear, hydro, and renewables. And if we are serious with mitigation, we should turn these numbers upside down during the coming decades. Next, please. And this is from European perspective. Europe would like to become carbon neutral by 2050, and here are the magnitudes of various factors behind. #1 is power, #2 transport, and thereafter it's industry, and thereafter we have smaller things like agriculture and forestry and other non CO2 factors. Next, please. So with these words, I hope that I was a messenger of bad news, and this is showing that we have a great challenge ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petri. And I think from here we would move on to Rob Jackson, representing the Global Carbon Project, and he will be speaking on the global fossil CO2 emissions. So please, Rob.
Yes, thank you, everyone. And I'm here representing hundreds of scientists who contribute to the work of the Global Carbon Project, and I want to acknowledge their work right from the beginning. So we in the Global Carbon Project track the three dominant greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. We do that in man-made systems, including industrial infrastructure and also agriculture, from oceans and land as well. And we also study cumulative, negative, and regional emissions. So next slide, please. Well, my take-home message today is this one. You've already heard hints of this. Global carbon dioxide emissions rose another 2% in 2018 and are on track to increase further in 2019. And I want to acknowledge the leadership of my colleague, Corinne LeCurre, for many years in this part of our work. The global economy grew by more than 3% last year and is likely to do so in 2019, increasing energy demands around the world. I mean, last year, emissions increased more than 2% in China and the United States, 8% in India. Emissions declined a further 2% in the European Union, continuing trends there. Now, we hoped we had reached peak emissions in the period of 2014 to 2016, the first time the world's economy grew without increasing CO2 emissions. However, emissions are rising again, and we risk missing both the 1.5 and 2 degree targets. So let's explore why that is. Next slide, please. First, the good news, as you just heard, renewables such as wind and solar are booming. All right, they grew 14% annually over the last 5 years, a doubling time of only 5 years. I mean, despite that substantial progress, fossil fuels such as oil and natural gas are still growing too. So global energy growth is expanding, and most new renewables aren't displacing fossil fuels. They're providing new energy infrastructure, and that's a key point. I mean, that must change. It isn't enough to build renewable infrastructure. We need to take fossil infrastructure offline. And the only fuel around the world for which that's beginning to happen is coal. Here in the United States, coal use has dropped 40% in a decade or two, replaced by natural gas, wind, and solar. Similar changes have occurred in the UK and other countries, and that's good news. Next slide, please. So I won't give a presentation on emissions without acknowledging per capita emissions. And here the US has shown steady decline, but has a long way to go. Our per capita emissions are 5 or more times higher than those in India and double those of the EU and China. And I say that every time and every place that I go. Global per capita emissions are declining a little, but the declines have slowed in the EU and the US in the last 5 or so years. And we also need to acknowledge the importance of global population and how many millions and billions of people end up on the planet. More people require more energy for a good quality of life, and energy poverty remains a concern for 1 billion or more people around the world who don't have access to clean electricity and reliable energy. Next slide, please. So there are success stories we can use as examples. At least 18 countries, representing 1/5 of the global economy, have seen their economies grow over the last decade while their carbon dioxide emissions decreased. These countries are distributed around the globe in Europe, Asia, North America, and the Caribbean, for example. The dominant causes were both increased energy efficiency, so actually reducing energy demand, and renewables displacing fossils. So we have templates, we have experience for how to do this. We need to figure out how to apply those templates to other places around the world and to acknowledge the other needs that different countries have for energy. Next slide, please. Well, we in the Global Carbon Project weren't comfortable here speaking only about carbon dioxide emissions, right? The global methane cycle has been altered even more by human activity than the carbon dioxide cycle has. More than half of methane emissions around the world come first from agriculture and second from fossil fuel use. We need progress in reducing emissions from cattle, Exciting research is being done to provide feed supplements to reduce methane emissions, for instance. Work is ongoing to change water regimes and reduce emissions from rice paddies. We also need to reduce emissions from fossil fuel extraction and use, including coal, oil, and natural gas infrastructure. And we need to understand emissions from natural systems, such as wetlands, better to place the human influence on the global methane cycle in its proper context. So all of these things and efforts are underway through research in the Global Carbon Project and many other entities around the world. Next slide, please. So we have a good sense of where methane emissions are in general through inventories such as this, such as these maps for wetlands, fossil fuels, agriculture and waste, biomass, and biofuel burning. We also have lots of exciting new tools, including drones, aircraft, satellites to find and measure methane emissions around the world. So I want to express a sense of optimism that our technologies and our resolution of those technologies are expanding rapidly. So I'm quite excited about these. Next slide, please. So everywhere I go, I like to provide a local example, if you'll indulge me. And our group, working with colleagues, provided the first publicly available maps of natural gas leaks. We put new lasers in cars and drove every block of cities such as Boston, Washington, D.C., and here in Manhattan. And that map on the right is the part of Manhattan we drove. Every dot on that map is a natural gas leak, a methane leak from natural gas infrastructure. And that cluster, about 2/3 of the way down, is right where we sit at the United Nations. And if we hopped in the car today, I could find you dozens of leaks through that infrastructure system in half an hour. This kind of information is not enough, but it does galvanize action in cities such as Boston that we provide the first maps for. The state passed new laws the next year to speed the repair and replacement of old pipelines using our data and the work of other people. So we can use this kind of information to get things done. And I think one lesson for us is that the real motivator for change in this system was safety, not greenhouse gas emissions, right? So I think the lesson is to use additional narratives of health, safety, national and economic security more often, not to emphasize the climate benefits alone. Next slide, please. And finally, we have a new priority, well, an ongoing priority in the Global Carbon Project of negative emissions. And the farther we go on the types of greenhouse gas trajectories that we're seeing, making 1.5 and 2 degrees C more difficult each year, it appears more likely that we will need technologies to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. There's a lot of work being done for carbon dioxide. We have a new initiative that we've started looking at methane removal from the atmosphere. I'm not saying this is easy. It's not abundant in the atmosphere, but I believe that we need research in these areas, and we have some proposals and research ongoing to do that. And that's a long-term goal, but I think should be done in parallel with the more important task of mitigation and emission reductions. But I think we can no longer ignore the importance of doing research to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Last slide, please. So in conclusion, we in the Global Carbon Project believe in the power of compelling science. However, I concur with the minister from Chile that science and data aren't enough. I mean, we need help with crafting narratives, communications, and understanding human behavior to affect change. And we also need to acknowledge that maximizing benefits beyond carbon are important. We need to consider water and the other sustainable development goals, and we can't manage the Earth with climate blinders on alone. Together, though, we can succeed. I want to thank you for your attention today.
Thank you very much, Rob. And with that, let's now move on to Professor Johan Rockström to present the climate insights from Future Earth. Johan?
Thanks, Lena. Good morning. Yes, I'm speaking on behalf of Future Earth, within which Global Carbon Project is a part, the scientific community that has added complementary value to this United in Science. And if you take the next slide, please. As Pertti Talas pointed out, at 1.1 degrees Celsius warming, we're starting to see extreme events. Just a reminder, this is the warmest temperature on Earth, according to the science we have today, that we've experienced since the last ice age. We're bumping at the ceiling of the biophysical capacity of the Earth system. We also have rising scientific confidence in terms of the attribution of these extreme events. In red here showing that heat, droughts, rain, ocean impacts are attributed to anthropogenic climate change. When we take the next, what I'd like to focus here is the complementary risks of nonlinear changes. This is a remarkable trend line in science as far as I see it. This is the trend line of scientific advancements over 4 IPCC assessments. The further to the left of the 3rd assessment, 2001, and then you have the 4th assessment, the 5th assessment, and further to the right in each cluster here, the 1.5 report. On the y-axis, you have average temperature, and the red ember shows the risk in terms of scientific confidence of knocking these systems over. The furthest to the left is the risk for threatened systems, like ecosystems. The middle group is on extreme weather events, and furthest to the right is large-scale discontinuities that would trigger tipping points. And as you can see the trend line here, as science advances over 20 years, it gets red at further down the temperature risk. So for ecosystems, the 1.5 report clearly shows that already at 2 to 3 degrees Celsius warming, we are at risk of really undermining biosphere systems. Extreme events goes from 6 degrees in the 3rd assessment, 2001, down to between 2 and 3. But look at large-scale discontinuities, where the risk is at a medium rate. Just 20 years back, we thought at around 6 degrees Celsius warming. Today, the same risk at medium to high level is down at 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. And this is, I really want to emphasize, not that we're increasing emissions and putting more pressure. It is as science advances. The more we learn of how the Earth system operates, the more reason concern we have. So Lena Srivastaba's point that we have reason to be careful in terms of the scientific conservativeness we live with, we also have a deeper understanding of the Earth system. So I want to focus here, if you take the next. Because we increasing at the frontier of science also understand that the Earth system is a self-regulating coupled system with a whole set of tipping elements that are interconnected with feedback dynamics that so far has helped us in dampening the warming impacts. And we understand these increasingly, but we also understand that they might have cascade effects that can self-amplify warming. If we take the next. Now, in some recent research that we've been trying to synthesize our knowledge here, we estimate in a quite conservative assessment that if we reach 2 degrees Celsius warming due to fossil fuel burning, we are at risk of passing a threshold where we can see feedback shift that could start self-amplifying warming, moving into this red terrain of slippery, uncertain stability of the Earth system, pushing us towards a point where we would have irreversible changes that would be unavoidable. As Petri Talas pointed out, we have the highest level of CO2 concentrations since the 3 million years, the whole Pleistocene. In fact, just to give a little additional element to that, recent modeling shows that we have never exceeded 2 degrees Celsius warming over that entire period, 3 million years. We're talking of a limit cycle between -4 ice age and +2 over the last 3 million years. And we are, as Lena pointed out, rushing towards 2.9 to 3.4. We take the next. So this means, if you click again, that just as Petri Talas pointed out, that we have tipping elements that are starting to misbehave. And this is the polar jet stream, the high air, 10 kilometers up in the air, which is starting to meander in planetary wave systems, the Rossby waves, which is locking in high and low pressure systems. We know today that this meandering system was the explanation why Hurricane Sandy in 2012 veered suddenly right into New Jersey and hit in a tremendously devastating way. We also know that 2018-2019 heat waves in Europe were probably explained by this meandering planetary wave pattern due to accelerated warming in the Arctic and the reduced pressure gradient, therefore, between, if you take the next, between the equator and the polar regions. We also see worrying signs to the left how this creates anomalies in temperature. In the red here, very high temperatures, and in blue, low temperatures, and how it also locks in a kind of a planetary wave pattern on wind patterns. Red is northern winds and blue is southern winds. So this is unexpected changes as 1 degree Celsius warming as we see shifts in large tipping elements in the Earth system. We take the next. We also see it in the ocean overturning system. As Petri pointed out, 90% of heat is absorbed in oceans. We also see how this is starting to change the behavior of the Gulf Stream, which is the precondition for life in the northern parts of the hemisphere where we come from, in the Nordic region, not least. A 15% slowdown in one of the tipping elements, the Atlantic overturning circulation. We take the next. This has already been covered, the fact that we are outside of the standard deviations on Arctic sea ice. If you take the next, the same pattern is 2019 for the Antarctica. If we take the next, please. And I just want to make the point here that this is not only contributing now almost to 0.8 of 1 millimeter of additional sea level rise each year. We are at a point where, for example, Greenland over the last few weeks behaves like in 2012, that the whole surface is liquid, which is therefore shifting from self-cooling, reflecting back incoming radiation, to self-warming. And this is the kind of feedback dynamics we do not want to see. Take the next. The Amazon is on fire, as we know, over 40,000 fires. The science so far shows that a threshold may be at 40% deforestation, meaning that you would have a tipping point where the Amazon would irreversibly move and shift towards a savanna. We have published research showing that global warming may push the system irreversibly towards a savanna at 4 degrees Celsius warming. But if you take the next, worrying science led by Carlos Nobres and here Tom Lovejoy indicates that when these two forces interact, deforestation and land system change plus global warming, the deforestation threshold may move down all the way down to 20 to 25%. We are today at roughly 18%. So we're coming nervously close to a point where we can no longer exclude nonlinear dynamics in one of these big Earth system regulating systems, the Amazon. Next, please. Now, the transformation here is clearly outlined by the IPCC, the trajectory of cutting emissions by half every decade, shown in the gray curve here for fossil fuels. As Rob pointed out, this is also so much to do with non-CO2 gases, which is largely related to not only industry, but also the food system. I just want to remind ourselves here that in red is the necessity of transforming the world's agricultural systems from the single largest source of greenhouse gases to becoming the single largest sink of greenhouse gases. We have the technologies, we know the practices to do this, transformation of the world's food system, but it's an equally large challenge as decarbonizing the energy system.
1 minute, please.
Yes. And taking the next, coming to a closure here on policies then, what can we do? There's so much that needs to be done, but here I think is one of the social scientific, let's say, convergences on the immediate action. And here we see the remaining global carbon budget being committed to the furthest left by non-fossil fuel use, or rather the already infrastructure in different fossil fuel uses. And the second, third, and fourth columns here are existing, under construction, and planned coal-fired plants, which shows that already with existing and under construction coal-fired plants, we bust the 1.5 carbon budget. And if we include the planned budgets, we approach the 2 degrees Celsius budget. We need immediate action to phase out coal. And if you take the next, the Stiglitz and Stern Commission show that this can be done with economic policies of introducing a carbon price of in the order of 40 to 80 US dollars per ton of carbon dioxide, increasing up to 50 to 100 US dollars, which would be enough as an incentive to really phase out coal. This is shown in the European Union, and Germany is now struggling with this right as we speak. This is a clear signal from science and the economics research. Next, please. So to close, today we actually released the exponential roadmap to show that we can cut emissions by half over the next decade in sector after sector, working on current technologies. And then final slide, next please. We're also launching this week the Earth Commission, which is an attempt to gather science around an integrated perspective of defining scientific targets for a stable and resilient Earth system to complement the great important advancements by the IPCC and the scientific community at large. And if you take just the next slide here, that this is connected also to implementation and solutions with business, because business is screaming for scientifically based targets of how to guide their business ventures. So this is quite an exciting example of co-design and co-development in science, and it's hosted by Future Earth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Johan. And the last speaker for this section would be Dr. Thelma Krug, IPCC Vice President. Thelma, over to you.
Thank you, Lina. Yes, thank you. So good morning, everybody. Oh, it's nice to have here the father and the mother of the IPCC, this young child of 31 years, and to be able to present some of the recent findings from the assessment of the climate change-related literature globe-wise. The findings of the IPCC since the first assessment in 1990 have been instrumental for policymakers to take informed decisions, particularly at the Climate Change Convention. So presently, IPCC is on its 6th cycle. It started in 2015, ends in 2022. And the 195 member governments of the IPCC have set to this cycle one of the most ambitious cycles ever. We are to produce 8 products until the end of 2022. So three of the products that IPCC is to deliver are special reports, 2 of which have been already delivered. And one is being considered now for approval in the Principality of Monaco. So they started this approval session a couple of days ago, and it's expected to end tomorrow, where we are going to have another special report that will address ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate. So on the top of the assessment reports that are produced as part of the contributions of the 3 working groups of the IPCC, and a synthesis report that puts together a synthesis of all the products produced by the IPCC during the cycle, we have these 3 special reports, of which 2, as I mentioned, have been approved, and which I'm going to be presenting some of the results. The first one is the special report on global warming of 1.5. All the products produced by the IPCC during the cycle. We have these 3 special reports, of which 2, as I mentioned, have been approved. All the products produced by the IPCC during the cycle. We have these 3 special reports, of which 2, as I mentioned, have been approved. All the products produced by the IPCC during the cycle. We have these 3 special reports, of which 2, as I mentioned, have been approved. All the products produced by the IPCC during the cycle. We have these 3 special reports, of which 2, as I mentioned, have been approved. All the products produced by the IPCC during the cycle. We have these 3 special reports, of which 2, as I mentioned, have been approved. All the products produced by the IPCC during the cycle. We have these 3 special reports, of which 2, as I mentioned, have been approved. All the products produced by the IPCC during the cycle. We have these 3 special reports, of which 2, as I mentioned, have been approved. You have mentioned, allow me to mention you as Minister Andres. There is a commitment of the IPCC to communicate with simple messages. Simple messages to convey the complex scientific findings of its reports, not only to policymakers, but also to stakeholders and the public in general, since each one has its own share of responsibility to mitigate climate change and to adapt to its potential impacts where necessary. So in this respect, for the 1.5 degrees Celsius report, the simple messages can be summarized as follows. Every bit of warming matters. It's okay, Lina, you can leave it there. It's okay, Claire, you can leave it there. Every bit of warming matters. Every year matters. And every choice matters. So this is something that is really appealing to everyone. You're not communicating the science, but you're really communicating the urgency of where we stand. So in this, we see the first bit, every bit of warming matters, which says, where do we stand? And human activities are estimated to already have caused 1 degree Celsius of global warming above pre-industrial levels in the likely range of 0.8 to 1.2. And at this level, we already have the consequences to livelihoods, natural and human systems that have already been observed. So if global warming continues to increase at the current rate of 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade, global warming is likely to reach this 1.5 between 2030 and 2052. So one of the important messages of the report was that past emissions did not commit the world already to 1.5. So that clearly indicated that we had a window of opportunity to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels at the end of this century. But there is another message coming from this optimistic information that says, but this will require unprecedented levels and efforts in all areas of society. So to limit warming to 1.5, so I think we can go to the next one. Thank you. Sorry, 2 minutes. Oh my goodness. So, okay, no, I had 8 minutes. Okay, so it's okay. To limit warming to 1.5 degrees, global anthropogenic CO2 emissions will need to decline by about 45% by 2030 relative to 2010 levels. This would be 25% to limit it to 2 degrees Celsius. Also, the CO2 emissions would need to reach net zero by about 2050, and it would be 2070 if it were to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius. So these deep reductions in CO2 need to be followed by deep reductions also of non-CO2 emissions, which besides contributing to mitigation of climate change, has immediate impacts on Earth, health, and agriculture. The pathways limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius would require, yes, that's okay, rapid and far-reaching transitions in energy, land, urban and infrastructure, including transport and buildings, and industrial systems. These system transitions are unprecedented in terms of scale and imply deep emission reductions in all sectors, a wide portfolio of mitigation options, and a range of technologies, behavior changes, and a significant upscaling of investments in those options. The second report, approved in the beginning of August, addresses climate change and land, and addressed desertification, land degradation, sustainable land management, food security, and terrestrial fluxes. And two of the messages this report brings can be summarized as, next one, land is under growing human pressure, and the next one, land is part of the solution, but it can't do it all. And to me, this is one of the most relevant messages that we have. Finally, the third special report, which I already mentioned on ocean and cryosphere in a changing climate, addresses the physical science basis and impacts of climate change on ocean, coastal, polar, and mountain ecosystems, and the human communities that depend on them. I am eagerly waiting for the simple messages that IPCC will produce for this report and hope that they will trigger actions consistent with the urgency that the matter deserves. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Thelma, and thank you also for trying to keep to time at the end. Sorry about rushing you so much. We now have some short interventions from other key organizations, and let me start by first inviting Professor Detlef Stammer, Chair of the Joint Scientific Committee of the World Climate Research Program.
Yeah, Professor Srivastava, thank you very much. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity given to me to speak here on behalf of the World Climate Research Program and to give an intervention response to the statement of the Science Advisory Group. Next slides, please. Being sponsored by the World Meteorological Organization, by the International Science Council, and by the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO that was mentioned already before, the mission of WCRP, in short, is to coordinate and facilitate international climate research to develop, share, and apply the climate knowledge that contributes to social well-being, very much in the spirit of what we talk about here. Next slides, please. And in this sense, the WCRP really fully endorses the Science Advisory Group statement. All the information, the facts that we have heard here today. And I think this is fairly complete, and I don't want to actually put in more, but I do want to stress that the urgency of a fundamental socio-economic transformation to avert dangerous global temperature increase with potential irreversible impacts. We have heard about it. I think we really cannot stress this enough, that we really need to urgently move forward. We also have heard about the fact that we are on a very high trajectory. We do not really come down at this point. And it requires that the longer we go along this line, we really need a dramatic reduction of CO2 emissions. In fact, we need to speak about negative emissions, very intensely about negative emissions, if we want to reach a 1.5 or even a 2-degree target. And we should not forget, the 1.5 degree sounds a little, well, small to us in this whole debate, but we should not forget we are at a 1 degree right now. All the things we have heard here about today reflect on this 1 degree. A 1.5 would be 50% higher, and imagine what that means for our life. But really thinking about this, next slide please, we really have to recall that we are talking about a fully integrated coupled system involving ice, atmosphere, ocean and land, and the cycles in between, that is water, that is energy or heat, and that is carbon. And all these things have a tremendous impact on society. Now, WCRP is really dealing with all these aspects. In fact, on timescales that you see around here, from seasons to decades to centuries. Next slide, please. And the work that WCRP is doing provides a fundamental understanding of the climate system, improves Earth system modeling capabilities for short-term and long-term predictions and projections, and really helps also to expand the global observing system and its capabilities really to monitor, first of all, the changes, but also we should not forget we need to monitor mitigation or adaptation impacts. That's not that simple. Next slide, please. Now, over the last 40 years, and this speaks not just for WCRP, but to the climate science community at large, what was accomplished is enormous, and that reaches from climate process understanding to observing climate change, in particular trends, to, in fact, simulating the climate system and projecting it into the future. That's the basis through CMIP, for instance, for IPCC reports and the assessments that are going on, and for system assessments, climate sensitivity studies, and human impact on climate. Next slide, please. And so the impact of this work is, well, first of all, provide the basis for IPCC assessments, the past, the ongoing, and the future one. And also the synthesis report that is in front of all of you has a lot of input from WCRP science and knowledge into this. So WCRP provided the evidence that humans are impacting climate, and we should not forget this, through, for instance, the modeling capabilities that were developed by the science communities and the observing capabilities. WCRP identified the predictability of climate on up to decadal timescales, also very important if it comes to information, to recommendations, also to stakeholders. But we should not forget one very important part. The climate system is enormously variable by itself. And so identifying actually and quantifying that variability, which is always superimposed to the human-induced trends, and sort of helping to use that for making the story that not every wiggle in the global temperature increase going down does not mean that climate change is not taking place anymore, is very important to actually tell the story of climate change. Next slide. Next slide, please. Now, one part I want to stress here, WCRP is working on the coupled system, and it was already mentioned several times, but I think it needs to be highlighted. We have heard about land surface impacts, about many other things, but the ocean is in fact a very important part of the climate system and climate change. And that is because, first of all, it has a memory, it has a momentum in the climate system, but it also, in fact, plays a very big service right now for climate change. In the sense that we have heard it, 90% of the excess heat is being absorbed, 28% of the excess carbon is being absorbed by the ocean, but we should not forget this comes with a price, with an enormous price. First of all, the acidification of the ocean goes up, impacting the ecosystem. The warming of the ocean, in fact, means sea level rise, meaning impacting the land surface. And there are heat waves in the ocean impacting the ecosystem development, coral reefs, and so forth, water cycle changes. So we have to remember that, in fact, the changing heat, the changing ocean is impacting the ability of the ocean to actually surf like this, and it will not be able to take up so much heat and carbon in the future. My last slide, and I leave it up here, the vision, a world that uses sound, relevant, and timely climate science to ensure a more resilient present and sustainable future for humankind. WCRP is committed to help here with partners, and it requires also a sustained commitment from nations to support the tools, the observations, and high-end computing. And with this, I will end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Let me now invite Professor Daya Reddy, President of the International Science Council, for his intervention.
Thank you very much, Chair. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, fellow scientists, good morning. I'm privileged to speak here on behalf of the International Science Council and the global science community that it represents on the occasion of the launch of this timely and most important high-level synthesis report. The world is facing an impending crisis. The scientific findings presented in the synthesis report convey with clarity and authority the stark reality of an existential crisis, one that is of our own making. The evidence of the anthropogenic nature of this crisis is incontrovertible. We are confronted on a daily basis with its immediacy, as experienced by communities around the world, and most severely by those that already grapple with extremes of poverty and inequality. Our confidence in characterizing our situation rests on the solid foundation of a scientific consensus. And it's important that we be crystal clear about the role of science in arriving at such an assessment. There's uncertainty, variability, of course, but nevertheless, the conclusion that extreme climate events and the prospects of these evolving towards a catastrophic conclusion as the result of human activity is based on an overwhelming consensus of the relevant and the best scientific expertise available. So the challenges are absolutely clear from the synthesis report. The international scientific community, for its part, is committed to providing actionable knowledge that can inform climate change solutions. And the International Science Council is committed to playing a leading role in such efforts, mobilizing and supporting knowledge from across its membership base, which spans the natural and social, cognitive, and behavioral sciences, to identify tractable pathways to global sustainability and to support societies in achieving the social transformations we now need in ways that are politically feasible and culturally acceptable. In this way, we shift gear and, in the language of the roadmap developed by the consortium led by Future Earth, move from incremental to exponential action. So, ladies and gentlemen, the ISC's vision is of science as a global public good. It is bold and it is vital at a time when science is too often not brought to the decision-making table, a time in which scientific understanding and interpretation appear to be less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion, beliefs based on personal experience, or the peddling of outright anti-scientific or pseudo-scientific views. This ultimately affects all of us and is of great concern as our shared future health and survival fundamentally depend on government policies and on public action that have a robust scientific basis. So we are hurtling down a precipitous slope, and the time for urgent and dramatic action is upon us. Have the next slide. That is the message from the truly global event of 2 days ago, the biggest climate protest in history, with young people in the vanguard, but with every conceivable sector of society represented. Next slide. The ISC's call to action action is directed in the first instance towards the world of science itself. It is a call to join us and our international partners, many of whom are here with us today, as we energetically engage in amplifying the impact of international, solutions-oriented climate and sustainability research, building vibrant science advisory ecosystems and new data-intensive scientific capacities in all parts of the world, and convening a global forum of funders to accelerate support for this work. We also call on the policy-making community to ensure that the political will to enact the necessary changes and to do so in partnership with science is in place. So I and the International Science Council and the scientific community are dead serious about transformation and stand ready to engage with the worlds of policy and business and civil society in actions aimed at tearing down the roadblocks on pathways to global sustainability. Today's event demonstrates that. With the political will to collaborate, I have hope for our planet, our science, and our future. And I do wish to emphasize the hopeful nature of this message. The last slide. So, united in science, building and deploying our knowledge together, most certainly we can succeed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was almost precisely in time. Greatly appreciated. We now have with us the Special Envoy for the Ocean, Mr. Peter Thompson, and I'd like to request you to add to this discussion.
How long do I have, Madam Chair? 3 minutes? 3 minutes. Very good, very good. Okay. Sorry, there's some kind of divine intervention went on there because I've been wandering around for the last half hour trying to find this room. It's one of the better hidden rooms at the UN. Madam Chair and ladies and gentlemen, the main point I really wanted to make is that a healthy ocean is required for a healthy planetary ecosystem. And we're doing our very best, it seems, at times, to destroy that ocean ecosystem, whether you're talking about pollution or harmful fisheries practices or the way the ocean is acidifying, deoxygenating, the way it's warming, and think of everything that that warming is doing. The first two that I mentioned are management. We can correct them under the 2030 agenda. The last three that I mentioned are less easily fixed. And they, of course, are related to one common cause, which is our greenhouse gas emissions. And that is going to take us, hundreds of years to turn that curve. But in doing so, well, firstly, obviously, we've got to get to net zero by 2050 in carbon emissions. But we also have to really trust science. And I know that's become a catchphrase now, but we've realized that for quite a long time here at the United Nations now. And it's why you see the measures in terms of the ocean action work that are based increasingly on science. The UN Ocean Conference, which will meet in Lisbon from the 1st to 6th of June next year, the member states, in their wisdom, chose scaling up ocean science as the theme for that conference. That's how we expect the conference to change the world, as the first UN Ocean Conference did in terms of awareness. And the UN General Assembly has also mandated the holding of a decade of ocean science for sustainable development, which will run from 2021 to 2030, which we expect to be a quantum leap in terms of understanding what's going on in the ocean's ecosystem. And at the moment, I have to say, we probably understand about 5% of it. So very important, number one, that we don't add new stressors while we're doing the science during the decade, that we don't add new stressors to the ocean's ecosystem. And I think you probably can think of a few of them. And secondly, that we have to get governments to ensure that they have got ocean action as an integral part of their nationally determined commitments. And that, of course, will be next year in COP25, is it? And so those are two messages that I really want to leave with you. You know, we're all part of a process here. I think, you know, as well as those conferences that I've mentioned, I think the big one in Kunming next year is where we've got to take some really important decisions based on science, which, you know, for example, moving from 20%, 10% of the ocean being covered by marine protected areas, which is our goal for next year, to 30% of the ocean to be covered by 2030. That sounds ambitious, but I believe we can achieve that in Kunming. So this is based on scientific advice that we have to make these changes in defense of the ocean's ecosystem. Madam Chair, I think I've exceeded 3 minutes, so I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. May I now invite our last intervention for this session, Ms. Shamila Nair Bedule, UNESCO ADG of Natural Sciences. Shamila.
Thank you very much, ma'am. And good afternoon, Excellencies, and it's a pleasure really to represent UNESCO here and its 193 member states, including all of you who are here with us here today. So thank you. UNESCO welcomes this high-level synthesis report, and as the previous speakers have mentioned, science is really at the forefront, and it's only through scientific excellence and promoting international scientific collaboration we do feel that we could make a difference to the world of climate change today. So if we move to the next slide, please. There are 3 tracks of science programs in UNESCO, which we hope will be very useful to this international community as we're looking at the recommendations that came out of the high-level synthesis report and really consider how the science programs and scientific services offered by UNESCO can really help its member states to strengthen the capacities for disaster prevention, climate risk management, as well as really the capacity to confront natural hazards. We've heard here how important it is to have the science policy dialogue, and that's the first track of the program of UNESCO, which includes the basics, sciences, technology, innovation, and knowledge. The second track is about advancing science for management of natural resources, disaster risk reduction, and climate change action. And the third track is really assisting countries to achieve water security through water diplomacy and its intergovernmental science programs and intergovernmental water programs. In the next slide, I'd like to show here UNESCO's designated sites. UNESCO has over 2,200 designated sites, over 1,100 World Cultural Heritage sites. And these sites are extremely important in providing let's say, capacity building to countries, and they serve as real action points, laboratories of learning on the ground, where we are able to transform the scientific knowledge produced by the international scientific community to action on the ground and to meet development needs. We are home also to 701 biosphere reserves. What are these biosphere reserves? These biosphere reserves are part of an intergovernmental program which aims to establish the scientific basis to enhance relationship between people and the environment. These 701 biosphere reserves are present in 124 countries, and we would like to offer this to the international community as laboratories for learning and where the science of living in harmony with nature and science of biodiversity conservation can really be put to use. We also have the geoparks. The 140 geoparks are present across the world, and they recognize sites of unique geological heritage sites. And we believe that these sites are really important learning sites where we promote the interdisciplinary climate knowledge and scientific collaboration. I'm not sure if somebody could hit the button for the next slide, please. Thank you. We've heard about the role for science policy dialogue, and here we see the number of different science programs which are hosted by UNESCO, intergovernmental and international programs. I've spoken about the geoparks, the Man in the Biosphere program. We have an international hydrological program which covers the 193 governments and member states. And this program is providing support to countries on water governance and water management. We also promote water diplomacy across nations, especially as regards the stresses due to climate change on scarce water resources. The International Center for Theoretical Physics is training some 6,000 scientists annually on Earth physics. Yeah, nearly done. So we believe that these are important resources that could be put to use to the international scientific community. And probably the last slide, could we, oops, one before that. Yeah. We also have the transboundary cooperation or eco-diplomacy between countries and governments in promoting cooperation between them on sharing of environmental resources, science-based management of environmental resources, and we look forward to working with you on that. And last slide, please. We have a network of some 4,000 participants, experts across the world, Category 2 centers, chairs, 193 commissions, science institutes, intergovernmental bodies, and the normative policy work. This transdisciplinary approach, we believe, is extremely important if we really want to meet the challenges of climate action today and for the future. And we as UNESCO would like to offer this service to the high-level synthesis report authors, to all the participants here, and we look forward to working with you as one of the partners with us, with UNESCO. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Samila, and that was a marketing presentation of UNESCO. We all think now that UNESCO is really a great organization. Thanks for that. So now we will go to 4 short presentations. We have been dealing as SAG with certain specific areas like energy transition, cities, and towards resilient transformations towards resilient societies and oceans, and then we will hear also a presentation on Earth observation and services that ECMWF is providing for us. And I will be again fairly strict that we keep the 5-minute limits. And first, I would like to give floor to Jörg Rogelyi, who is going to tell us about energy transition issues. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to talk here a bit about the challenges and the opportunities of the low-carbon energies transition together with my colleague, Professor Mulugeta. Next slide, please. The overarching challenge for the energy transition is really to move into a state where producing energy generates no or actually actively removes carbon from the atmosphere. And this transition can be split in 4 parts, which you can see here. And each of those parts can be quantified in terms of what will be consistent with limiting warming to the goals of the Paris Agreements. And this is actually drawn from the IPCC 1.5 degree special report. So first, we need to improve efficiency. By mid-century, our global energy demand should be roughly where we are today. And the challenge, of course, is to achieve this while still increasing energy access for development in developing countries. Second step would be, or the second part would be to electrify our transport, our appliances in buildings and our industrial processes. But of course, electrification only works as a low-carbon transition measure if we also decarbonize our power system. So that means we need to switch to low carbon and renewables in our power system so that producing electricity actually produces no excess or puts no excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere or actually results in an active removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by the mid-century. And finally, we need to substitute any residual fuels with low carbon alternatives, particularly in hard decarbonized sectors like the international transport sectors. Each of those parts requires urgent action and policy decisions in the next years to actually achieve the rapid transformation and achieve these goals by mid-century. And importantly, when making this transition, we can make strategic choices about how we can achieve it. And these choices, they matter for sustainable development. They matter for whether the energy transformation actually supports or counteracts our broader goal to achieve sustainable development. And science has identified some robust synergies between the energy transformation and some of the SDGs, but also some areas where there are potential trade-offs that can be avoided. And fortunately, science has also identified that demand-side measures, so that means measures that make our lives more efficient and lower the amount of energy, materials, or land that we use, allow us to maximize synergies with development goal? And on this topic, my colleague, Professor Mulugeta, will provide further insights.
Thank you, Dr. Rogel. Well, a lot what Jury has outlined actually relates to how energy consumption and production affects the delivery of outcomes across all SDGs, and in many ways, this is reflected in this slide. Next, please. Next slide. But this also speaks to the whole question of co-benefits in terms of climate actions, and argues that energy transitions across sectors can yield significant immediate public health and social benefits, and potentially also create high quality employment. And when discussing energy transformations and energy transitions, the least developed countries are of special interest in this. While the notion of decarbonization speaks to the situation of the advanced economies and to some extent also emerging economies, the effort to avoid future emissions is one that has currency in the LDCs. Firstly, over 60% of their population has no access to electricity, and with the figure rising to 80% in rural areas. And secondly, consumption levels on a per capita level remain very low in these countries, not because they are super efficient necessarily, but because they are too poor to consume. And so this implies that the poorest people in developing countries already have low carbon footprints, well below the average per capita emissions needed for a 1.5 degree or below 1.5 degree world. But this is changing quite rapidly. Energy demand across countries are increasing, and the energy mix of many countries are undergoing major changes, driven by increases in population, urbanization, rapid urbanization, and sustained economic growth. The question then is, how do we maintain current emissions, but enhance well-being and achieve higher levels of productivity? But all this cannot happen without a major technology transfer and adoption of new technologies and clean technologies, new financing and investment of infrastructure, and large-scale capacity development, all of which require radical, evidence-informed policies. Some countries, such as Bhutan, Ethiopia, and Rwanda, are making some heroic efforts in this regard, and plenty of experimentation is happening. Just half a minute. And finally, it's worth emphasizing that we are at a point when policymakers are making major decisions on the future of their infrastructure. Serious collaborations and partnerships will be needed to help them leapfrog to new and low-carbon technologies that would avoid investments in carbon-intensive systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacob, and then we will go on to next item, which is cities, infrastructure, and local action, and that will be presented by Cynthia Rosenzweig. Please.
Thank you, co-chairs, and congratulations on the synthesis report. It's well known that cities have a major leadership role in responding to climate change in regard to mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. This is because it's well known over half the world's population live in cities. Cities are responsible for about 70% of greenhouse gas emissions and 80% of the global economy. Also, every city has citizens who are highly vulnerable to climate change. This is true both in developing countries and developed as well. Next slide, please. There are many groups that are forming and that have formed in this and acting on climate change, encouraging action on climate change in cities. This is one of them. It's a bottom-up network of researchers and practitioners who provide the knowledge that enables cities. That's what's needed. This has strong links and contributes to the IPCC, which is also taking on coming to a realization of the importance of urban areas in regard to there's the IPCC new urban research agenda and the special report on cities, which is due in the 7th cycle. Next slide, please. I want to bring you, cities are very active. And so yesterday there was this, I want to report on a very interactive session yesterday, standing room only, in which practitioners and decision makers and scientists all came together. There was really excitement around working together, coming together to really in a new way for the ambition to 1.5. Next, please. This is the last slide. These were the outcomes just from the meeting and the outcome yesterday, but it's also in the big book of assessment report, which was also launched online at the UCERN website yesterday. What is needed in regard to science for 1.5 in cities? This echoes what we've heard. Massive ramping up of urban climate science, physical, biophysical, and socioeconomic. The behavioral issues came up again in discussion. We need high-end data, granular data, massive amounts of data for urban indicators and monitoring, so cities can actually track the climate and the programs that evaluate the programs that they are instituting. There's a recommendation for city climate change panels with local scientists to nurture this relationship, and it has to be long-term. That's key to creating the ongoing knowledge and science foundation for decision-making in urban areas needed in the coming decades. And finally, just to say a bit more about UCERN, UCERN has hubs all over the world in key cities because not every city can have the knowledge and science that is needed. So climate services, things like the urban hubs, all these outreach efforts are needed to actually build the capacity for cities to respond. Thank you.
Great, and that was the first presentation. That was 2 minutes before the deadline, so that's well done. So I like that attitude. So and finally, out of this our SAG group, I would like to give the floor to Maisa, and she will tell us about resilience and adaptation related to societies and oceans. Please.
Thank you. Can I? Yes. Thank you. So we have heard, I think. We have heard a lot about where we are and what that means to us, and I'm going to very briefly focus the discussion now on what this means for adaptation and resilience, and what I would argue for the need for transformation. We heard a little bit about the transformation in the energy system. I think that it's well accepted, well understood, but the need for transformation, for adaptation and resilience, I would say it's somehow lacking a bit behind. Next, please. There has just been about 10 days ago, right, the publication of the Global Commission on Adaptation, a report that tells us that climate is upon us and his impacts are getting more severe each passing year. And this means that there are many parts of the world, and hence many people in the world, that are starting to live unknown climates in comparison to what we know before. And we have heard this the whole morning already. I would say that the narrative of the 2 special reports, and I believe that the special reports of the IPCC that will be approved hopefully in the coming days, are telling us that these facts are requiring a transformation in all aspects of our society. Next, please. Just from this report, I wanted to highlight a couple of things that I thought were critical for bringing adaptation to the same level as the discussion we have on mitigation. Next, please. So it is the mandate of the Global Commission of Adaptation is to accelerate adaptation and build resilience. Next, please, to increase the visibility of climate risk, to convince people that what we are talking about is about risk, actually. And the very positive outcome of this report, I would say, is that it very clearly shows that investing in adaptation allows not only avoiding losses, but it will have economic benefits as well as social and environmental benefits. Next, please. The report focuses on those key areas, and again, in view of this need of adaptation, I just highlight two, which, as a physical climate scientist, the water, the adaptation for water, it's quite clear to me that requires a fundamental transformation on the governance of water, but in a lesser degree to myself at least, that it also requires a transformation in finance. Otherwise we would not be able to provide the means for that adaptation. And as an example of what we've been doing back in Chile, trying to provide some information in particular about adaptation for the COP, we noticed that our own national adaptation plans, and I can speak for at least all the national adaptation plans in Latin America, they are really just starting to exist. They need an update, and then they need to exist first. They need an upgrade, and they need an update with quantifiable goals and objectives, including baselines that do not exist in many cases. So how do we measure how we are going to advance in adaptation? And these indicators can be measured in results and process indicators as well as efficiency and effectiveness of the indicators. Next, please. Adaptation is as a crossroads. We need to link this a lot more closely to sustainable development. There is a very important need to bring back or to emphasize the social dimensions of vulnerability. Next, please. And we see that most adaptation is incremental, and that is just not sufficient. Next, please. We require a system transformation. Next, please. So what are, though, the key challenges and approaches to achieve this transformative adaptation? This is the last slide. Thank you. I would say that the most important thing is to transcend current thinking, explore unimagined possibilities. It requires to do science in a different way and probably to acknowledge different kind of knowledge outside scientific knowledge. And transformational change requires to explore drivers, different kind of disruptive changes, thinking about different transformational pathways and a range of possibilities and uncertainties as well. And with that, I finished. There was just one slide on the ocean that I might just maybe leave there. The next slide, it's about the UN Ocean Decade and how working closely together with the Sustainable Development Goals can achieve a healthier ocean, as the Special Envoy said. Thank you.
Thank you, Maisa, and I realized that Peter also woke up after seeing this slide, so which was a good sign. So finally, I would like to give floor to Florence Rabier, and she's leading the world-leading Center of Forecasting. It's what many Europeans are proud of, and this center has started also provision of climate services as part of the Copernicus program, and Florence will tell us where we are today. Please.
Yes, thank you very much, Petteri. And really, there couldn't have been a better setting to talk about the role of Earth observations than this event called United in Science, because this is really a collaborative effort that we need to gather all the observations. Next slide, please. So Earth observation is really at the heart of our science, and it's been used to understand the processes in our Earth system. But in meteorology, we've been using this for decades, of course, to observe the weather, and more recently to understand and monitor the climate. So all sorts of
observations in situ and satellites, and the beauty of our science is that these are shared, and in particular in meteorology, they are shared in real time, but for the weather as well, we have additional data coming in behind the time. Next slide, please. So these observations, you will have seen that from Peteri's slides. These observations contribute, of course, to monitoring the climate. And as Petteri said, there are a few more lines in this curve. This monitoring the climate of the Earth was dominated by NOAA, NASA, and the Hadley Center in the UK. You now have two newcomers, Japan and the European Union, the work we are doing in our center. But the beauty of it is that the more you have of these different estimates of the same parameter, the more you can have confidence in the results. So in the distant past, when we had less observations, obviously you can see a few discrepancies. But in the more recent past, with the advent of satellites, etc., it all converges to the same message. What's interesting is also the two newcomers are using slightly different methods, so we are actually combining all types of observations with models in order to give a consistent view of the climate. So it's not exactly the same thing as just using observations, but it gives the same results when you look at it globally. So basically, the message is strong. Earth observations, the more you have it, the more robust, and different estimates can help to consolidate, to make the message absolutely uncontroversial. But of course, now that we know that the Earth is warming, we need to do something about it and control CO2 emissions. And I would like to talk as well about what we need there. And of course, we need observations. And we need a comprehensive global greenhouse gas observing system. We need that networks of observing systems, of course, and constellations of satellites. I've put there a few flags because these are the countries, or in the case of the European Union, a group of countries already contributing or having in their plans some satellites to measure the CO2 and the greenhouse gases. And this is very important to consolidate what we will know about the CO2. But of course, you have more observations, it's good, but you can't observe everything at every time. And also, what these measure is actually CO2 concentrations, which is not quite the same as CO2 emissions, as you know. It's only, emissions are only a small part of the concentrations. And what you need on top of these really global Earth observation system, what you need is combining this with modeling in order to create really an Earth system modeling infrastructure to combine everything to have the most robust estimate of emissions. This is the only way we can see top-down what the emissions will be. Plenty of observations. Also, the inventories will help, but a model as well. So there is in particular an initiative from the European Union to create such an Earth system modeling infrastructure in the context of the Copernicus program. And we are discussing, so of course, the European Union, ESA, EUMETSAT, and ECMWF, who might be some of the partners of this initiative. But it's more than the European Union, of course. There are discussions ongoing with China, who are also then thinking of this constellation, and we really need all the efforts from all over the world to contribute to the science behind it, but to contribute observations. But in the end, it's only through this really Earth system initiative that we will have the real resource in order to really contribute to the global stocktake and also to monitor how we are doing collectively on our road towards the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Thank you. That was also New York 5 minutes, so thanks. And finally, I would like to give the floor to UNOSA Director Simonetta Di Pippo. So you will have New York real 3 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Allow me to go straight to the point. Climate change is one of the defining challenges of this era, and our ability for an effective global and targeted climate action relies heavily on the availability of data. Space assets certainly stand out, as more than half of the 54 essential climate variables can only be measured from space. This has been said already, but I want to reiterate from a global perspective. To make easier access to climate-related data and products derived from space, the Office for Outer Space Affairs, we have been partnering with space agencies, currently 20, from around the world to form the so-called Space Climate Observatory, SCO, with the aim of gathering efforts at the international level to help monitoring the changing climate and mitigate its effects. We are making the most of our unique position in the UN to serve as the bridge of the SCO, the Space Climate Observatory, to the UN Secretariat. Making sense of climate data is important for well-informed decision-making and for tailoring appropriate policies to achieve the pledges of the international community, and we have no time to waste. The science of climate change is becoming more and more apparent, and the implications threaten our efforts towards sustainable development. Natural disasters are one of the most prominent examples. In the last 20 years, they caused 1.3 million deaths and trillions in damages and affected over half of the population. And climate change renders them more frequent, more severe, and occurring in unprecedented locations. Space infrastructure represents one of the critical tools for disaster management. But here, we still experience a significant technological gap between countries, which hinders the use of these assets for the benefit of millions around the world. Through the UN Platform for Space-Based Information for Disaster Management and Emergency Response, better known as UN SPIDER, which is one of our programs, we are bridging this divide. UNUSA facilitates knowledge sharing and strengthening of institutions around the world. Over the years, we have supported around 40 UN member states in the use of space technologies for disaster risk reduction through dedicated institutional missions. And taking advantages of UNUSA's unique network, we bring together the space community, the user community, civil protection, civil society, and policy and decision makers for the benefit of all. Climate action is imperative for a safe, prosperous, and peaceful future, we know all. As the contribution of space in this regard is undeniable, it is in the best interest of everyone to expand opportunities to enable access to the space environment and the data, applications, and services stemming from its use. And that's exactly what we are striving to do on a continuous basis, while at the same time increasing awareness inside and outside the UN of the power of space activities in tackling the challenges of our times. At the time when the Earth is warming, glaciers are melting, sea levels are rising, and species disappearing from the surface at an ever-increasing rate, we stand ready to support nations and also to support the UN in utilizing space and its benefits for a positive impact on the future of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and that was the end of this presentation session, and now I'd like to give the floor to Pavel, and he will take care of the interactive session. So if you have anything to add or ask, Pavel is now taking care of that. Please.
Thank you very much, Petri and Elina. Thanks to you, we are now really on time, so we are caught up. We will have a half an hour from between now and closing, before the closing of the session. So before I start, I would like to thank you to all of you here for exciting collaboration we have had over the last couple of months. It was one of the most exciting enterprises to see how the science can collaborate across all possible partners. Thank you for that. I would like to do three things in this half an hour. First, very briefly invite some of the important players in the audience who did contribute a lot to this course, very briefly to give them 1.5 minute statement time. Then I would like to go for the open questions, any question you may have in contribution to what he heard. And in the end, I will challenge those who presented with the one question which I find always exciting to use in this particular gremia, which is the following. The science has been there, science has been showing to be together, but we always have been looking for funding, for money. I'm going to ask Future Earth and our colleagues here, but also Global Carbon Projects and others, WCRP. Suppose there is an Apollo project to bring science closer to solution. Suppose there is a 10 billion funding available tomorrow. What would you do with this money to accelerate the process? So those three parts of this debate I would like to come up. So the first one is from the audience sitting here. There are a couple of agencies who were interested to give us their statement. So let me start with UNDRR.
Great. Well, thank you, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. We appreciate the opportunity to kick off the discussion. And we also very much welcome the launch of this report, United in Science, and hope that we can contribute in future as you continue to develop similar reports. I think we simply wanted to stress 2 points that were raised by speakers during their presentation. First, that while we have seen significant advances in research on hazards, we also stress the need for further work on the science of vulnerability and exposure or adaptation. I was a lead author on the IPCC Special Report on Land and helped lead the risk assessment. And we reviewed hundreds of papers on future changes in hazards, but we found large gaps in modeling of future vulnerability and exposure, which made the risk assessment very difficult to make at times. As was mentioned in some of the presentations, we also are facing increasingly complex and systemic risks. UNDRR's GAR report 2019 highlights some of these and the need for greater understanding in this area. The second point that we wanted to make relates to the nature of data and supporting countries in their science. So how do we ensure that all countries can contribute to the science? It was mentioned that there's increasing number of satellites and countries participating in that, but how do we ensure that more countries from the global south can also contribute to this research? We in UNDRR have the Sendai Framework Monitor, and we've found large gaps in countries' ability to report on issues such as disaster losses. And we hope that governments will help encourage technology transfer or South-South learning so that we can have a broader range of countries contribute. I, for example, was the first IPCC author from Latvia, and that's a European country. So it just shows how far we still need to go in making sure that our science is really inclusive of the entire world. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much for clear commitment to this discourse. The other important group in the room is a group which is called the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, with a knowledge to the implementation. And we have here Guido Schmidt-Raub to say a few words about how far that network went in producing solutions.
Thank you very much, Pavel. This is really important work. I know it's not easy to get so many scientists to coalesce around a shared report. I think this is going to make a big contribution. The science is really clear. We need further advances, better data that's clear. We're not seeing the response that comes anywhere close to what we need to do. There are some things that I think beyond the ability of this room to shift. We don't really do politics on a day-to-day basis, but I would argue that there's a few more knowledge gaps that we need to devote far more attention and action to. Broadly speaking, as has come clear, if we're looking at a response to climate change, you need two strategies. One is on energy systems, and the other on land use and food systems. And cities, of course, cut across them. On the energy side, I would say that we have fairly good clarity on what needs to be done. The hindrance here is really implementation. On the land use and food systems, I would propose that we do not have this. We're working with about 24 countries around the world, and we're seeing that countries do not even have the analytical tools to understand quantitatively their land use and food systems. It's very fragmented. And this is some of the biggest challenges are in the so-called developed countries, where governments today are unable to say if our beef consumption increased by 10 percentage points, what might that do to pressure on land use systems? And these are very, very important questions. And we don't see enough work happening on closing that gap. It's difficult, but this is ultimately science. And that's something I'd like to engage you on and would love to offer some thoughts on this, because ultimately we need to ensure that governments, it's a necessary, not a sufficient condition, but if governments don't even understand their food and land use systems, how can we expect them to take decisive action on something as complex as that? That's what I would say is one of the biggest challenges, and what the science community needs to do is also become better. And there has been a huge amount of progress, particularly on the energy side, is yes, global models are fantastic, we need them, but ultimately it is national policymakers that will bend the needle, and we need more tools really applied at national levels. Thank you.
Thank you again. Let's move now to the open block in this part of the morning and afternoon for the open question. Please, when you ask a question, make comment, state your name and agency behind you. Who would like to be the first? Peter, you can skip the agency and name.
Yeah, thanks a lot. No, just that last comment. I was captivated by that, where you basically said on energy, we know what we have to do, it's a matter of implementation, but on land and food systems, we don't. Could you just expand on that a little bit?
So, let me just give you the example of one country that shall go unnamed that has recently introduced a massive program to support biofuels to boost smallholder farmers' incomes. And when you then ask the question to the policymakers, well, what impact might that have on food security, on water demand, on greenhouse gas emissions, the answer is, sorry, we don't know. Not because they don't deem this important, but because that country doesn't have a tool to understand, to put these pieces together. If you take the European Union, one of the more sophisticated regions in the world, we've got quite a sophisticated common agricultural policy that's moving slowly into the direction of including climate change issues and biodiversity issues. But the biggest driver of land use change, and this of course where the link to the ocean comes in, is diets. We know that. But those two policy arenas don't even communicate to each other. Agricultural policies on the production side do not talk to the demand side. These are ships passing in the night. Again, I'm not advancing this as the solution, but it's a necessary step. And I don't want to advertise another report, but here I go. This is a report that we put out in July. It's from the FABO consortium. It's the first attempt by 19 countries, national teams, to think through what are integrated pathways towards sustainable land use. And it really shows up massive knowledge gaps, ones that we are trying to fill. And I think these are areas where we can make quite fast, quite rapid progress if we pull together. And I call this to be short, land use and food systems, but it really is land use, oceans and food systems, because oceans, of course, and the biggest driver of ocean degradation is overfishing right now.
Good debate, and just there are a couple of events this week which are focused on launching different coalitions about the land transformation. One is tonight here. Who would like to be next? Yes, please.
Oras Tynkkynen, Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra. We have been in small part involved in supporting the emissions gap report, and that brings us here. Thank you very much for the synthesis report and the presentations today, which I think highlight clearly our growing understanding and sophistication in our understanding of the climate system. My question, though, is in three parts, and it is that many of you have said that the science is clear, and it has indeed been clear enough for a long time for us to take action, and yet we see global emissions growing consistently. And this brings me to my three questions, first of which is, should we focus more on the behavioral and the political aspects of slowing down the necessary change and transition? Today's discussion has been focused quite a bit on the natural sciences part, which is obviously important, but it seems to me that the challenges lie in the other areas. Secondly, should we focus more on science communications? This is a solid piece of work. To what extent it will be read by policymakers remains to be seen. And finally, bringing back to what the Chilean minister said in the beginning, should we focus more on strengthening the structures that we have to integrate evidence into policymaking, to make sure that whatever the science community comes up with is actually taken up by the policy community?
Thank you. Minister, you wanted to make a comment anyway, so maybe there is a more reason for that now.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Based on the previous comment, but I was going to mention it anyway, I think it's very important that we don't miss the opportunity to encourage you to decide what messages and the timing for those messages in COP25. I think it would be very important to understand what we need to communicate it clearly, and decide when, in terms of both the timings and the topics of the negotiations, but also the timings and the topics of the spotlight that will be created around the topic for those 2 weeks. So totally in line of what you were saying before. I would really make an effort to use the information, which is solid, is absolutely compelling, communicated very clearly, communicated to the public, communicated in terms of a good timing and good topics for COP25. I think we should be very precise as to when to communicate and when to communicate those topics.
Thank you very much. There was a comment from there.
Yeah. I'm Jörg Meyer-Ries. I'm working in the Federal Environmental Ministry of Germany. So I think there are not a lot of people from the political administration in the room. So let me take that as an opportunity. My first, thank you very much for all these presentations. As a normal citizen also, this is really, I just want to share with you that this is paralyzing, really, what you are reporting. I know about that since 15 years from the ministry, but it's again paralyzing, and even more as we go forward. So my impression is that we are paralyzing at the moment the politicians and the citizens. And the colleague from Chile reported about that. I was very thankful for that. So I think it's really about how to bring this evidence beside these reporting in other ways to the public and to the politicians. And I think the science for that is not enough up to now. So in Germany, we just brought together, for example, the first time in 30 years, I think, at least a relevant number of scientific councils in one room to speak to each other. Because the science for biodiversity, the science for climate, the science for family questions, and the science for economics is working absolutely apart from each other. And so they first time spoke to each other about the problems of the future and the problems how to bring their scientific knowledge over the table. So I think this is very interesting. And I would plead for you to invite to such meetings also other natural scientists from other branches and also economic sciences, social sciences, cultural, psychological sciences. So I think it's also very valuable that we have the city or the UNESCO with its events and networks over here. And the second thing I would like to say is I also, my observation in Germany, for example, but I think it's worldwide, is that, for example, the young people transport at the moment at the most efficient way the scientific knowledge. And it's absolutely necessary to bring these young people also into this room to listen what you, because also for them I think that's paralyzing, and how to work with that, it's absolutely important to help them not to give up and how to develop some transformative behavior, structures, systems, political systems. So I think there's much more to do on this side of, and that's even scientific work. And a third pillar, I think, is the media. I mean, we have a tremendous media attention in Germany for climate and a lot of environmental things. But just this morning I read the weather report of the Spiegel Online, which is one of the most famous journals. And they wrote about, oh, it's sorry, this summer is past. We don't have one of these more wonderful sunny days. I mean, this is crazy. If you have 6 months of sunny days in Germany, the farmers are depressed because they can't produce any more anything. In Germany, we have a water crisis in Germany, which we've never had. So this is in somehow really paralyzing also every politician, every citizen. So I think to think about that is a big scientific task.
Thank you very much. I think we should come back to this point later. I think Rob was next one and colleague here.
No, and I appreciate both questions and comments. I'll be brief. There are, for those of us who work in countries where there's a substantial amount of the population for which climate isn't a strong motivator or political motivator, I would love to work with the groups here on communication tools that uses different language. As an example, I mentioned the coalitions to repair methane leaks from streets are built around the theme of safety, even though they accomplish the goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. If I talk to a conservative business group, I don't talk about reducing emissions. I talk about the fact that coal and cars kill tens of thousands of Americans every year, and that a green energy system will save lives. You don't have to mention climate to do that. The reasons to support increased vehicle fuel efficiency are the fact that we still import 3 million barrels of OPEC oil a day to the United States, and that's harming our national security and our balance of trade. So if there's an opportunity for us, we have good communications folks from Future Earth and elsewhere here, if we had the ability to craft some products around different types of language and could brainstorm on that, that is something that I personally would be very interested in pursuing.
Thank you very much. Let me go this side first. So I think you were first, and then we skip to the other side.
Thank you very much. My name is John Christensen, standing in for Inga, who had to run off. And just thanking you also for the collaboration. It's been wonderful. And but a little bit of response and maybe a little advertisement also. I mean, we have a short version of the paper in the joint publication. If you're interested, we have a longer 10 years, 10 pages lying over there on the shelf, and it's also available. But what we also have done and launched yesterday is a special chapter looking at what the G20 countries can potentially do about this, to try and point out, not to say who should do what, because that's not our job, but just to point out what are the technical and political possibilities that are available, and have a political discussion about what will it take to make it happen. Because I think very much with the debate that's starting now is that I don't think you can scare people into action. I mean, that's not the way people react typically. You need to have a vision for a wonderful green future with renewables and electrical cars and whatever that people want to go to. And I think that is kind of where we need to take it. I mean, in the GAP report, we always try to first have the bad news and then come with the good news afterwards about you can actually still do it, and here are some of the ways that you should be acting to move. But it doesn't get to the point of starting to have the first handle really to, so where do you start, what do you do? I think in this year's report, we're trying to look at 2 or 3 things. One is what does transition really look like? I mean, how does it link with the other SDG impacts, and how can we actually make a transition? And with the help of Jakob and others, we are having a chapter, what does that mean for the energy sector? What does transition really look like? And it's very much what you presented here also in terms of moving to renewable electrical transportation and really improving the sort of power sector, because that's where it's all going to happen in the energy part. So I think you can look at all these things, but just to emphasize that we are trying to do it, but it is also a tricky communication to make. But I think it's important to have the dialogue about these are the options. Why is it not happening? Is it politics? Is it money? Is it technology? What are the barriers to actually moving and help countries move along? And we have a couple of things coming up tomorrow, especially on efficiency. Have something called the 3% Club. You can't really launch things today, so we wait till tomorrow. But essentially, countries are signing up, willing to look at can we improve efficiency every year by 3%, because that can cover a huge part of the initial action that's required. So it is coming, but slowly, too slowly.
Thank you very much, and thank you also for reminding the extended report. Just for information, if you look on the back side of the synthesis report, there is a website, and that website is a repository of all the in-depth reports which were prepared to support the synthesis by all the agencies, UNEP, Global Carbon Project, Futures, WMO, so you can find it there already as of 10 o'clock this morning. It was under embargo. Thank you for that. So on the other side here, who was the first? You, Amy?
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Amy Loers from Future Earth. Thank you for this great overview. I wanted to sort of build on what has just been said in the comments here, and that is that, yes, the science is clear, and we have strong science about the need for action and what to do, but the science is very limited on how to drive societal transformations. And I think there was a hint of the need for more on social science, more on science communication, but I think that the type of social science we need on societal transformation goes a lot more than science, than the communication of science. And I think what we need to do in thinking about this as we have meetings like this in the future is that we not only need to co-produce knowledge, what we're doing here is we're co-producing our future. We need people in the room who are from civil society and from business working together about how we make this change. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think I will turn now to the right side of the room, please.
Good morning. My name is Yamina Saheb. I am not representing any organization here, but I am one of the IPCC lead authors. And I flew from Paris to New York just to raise awareness about the little-known Energy Charter Treaty, which is a treaty that protects investment in fossil fuels. This treaty was ratified in the 90s. Now we have 54 countries member of this treaty. And if government put in place policies to change the regulations for the carbon neutrality, we know that we need regulations, then governments are sued in private arbitration. The last threat to this kind of policies, to climate policies, is in Netherlands 2 or 3 weeks ago, because Netherlands are going to pass legislation to end coal by 2030, and the German coal company Uniper has sent already signal that they are going to sue the Dutch government, and this will cost €1 billion of taxpayers' money that we should be using for transition. We have to pay for that. So I don't know how different organizations present here could help, but we are trying in Europe to get out of the Energy Charter Treaty. We are calling to end the Energy Charter Treaty. And what you need to keep in mind is that in addition to that, European countries are all locked with this treaty. They are trying to expand the treaty to the developing world. In French, we call this treaty traité climaticide, because we consider that this is the way to lock the world in carbon emissions. Any help that you could like to provide? If you'd like to have more information, you could Google Euractiv. It's a Brussels-based news, Euractiv Energy Charter, and you will find a lot of information there. Thank you.
Thank you for the information. I think Johan was also having his hand up.
Yes, thanks. I wanted to just follow up on a few of the great questions that have come up here, and just to say how much I fully support the direction of the discussion here, that of course science must step up in partnership, as Amy points out, to co-design and co-develop with stakeholders outside of science, as the minister also pointed out. But I just want to raise a little flag of caution here. I think it's important also for the scientific community not to be entirely carried away by the situation we're seeing today, and that we play different roles. And I think what you presented here, Florence, about the confidence in just the temperature curves, and that we have now multiple sources. We have an Earth observation network that gives the data on the oceans in a way that raises the confidence. And we all know that if we hadn't had the carbon dioxide persistent measurement of CO2 in Hawaii over the last 50 years, we wouldn't have been where we are today in terms of being able to have the lever of change. I would argue that the IPCC is a slow variable, but it's a really important floor to stand on in every step we take along the way. So in that sense, I would call for the next generation of Earth system science. I think that's what the WCRP is really flagging as the vision. I mean, to understand the integrated whole Earth system. Put part of those 10 billion in that, and then develop the next 10 modeling groups around the world to support the next generation of the CMIP. I think Amy's point about social science transformations, I mean, we don't know how to transform in time, and we need the social science behind that. And Guido's point is quite paralyzing. That's, to me, paralyzing, that we don't know how to transform the food system over the next 30 years, because we know we'll fail on Paris if we don't get the food system right. It's quite alarming, actually. Even if we decarbonize the energy system, we will not be under 2 degrees Celsius unless we are successful in the land-ocean transition. And then just finally, just one little comment on paralysis. I mean, I see the point. I just want to say that scientifically, I think we're coming to a point where we have scientific justifications for talking of a planetary emergency. Now, if you go out public, scientifically stating a planetary emergency, that may lead to even further paralysis. But I would argue very strongly that a planetary emergency point, which I think we have justification for because of the risks we're facing and the speed of change that we are basically communicating, we have a decade to half emissions, should be a trigger for an exponential transformation. It should be like unleashing, let's say, lifting ourselves out of the conventional to the unconventional. That's what the youth movement in the world is calling for, that please, adults in the world, step out of your status quo mode and move out into taking risks and being a little bit more courage, have a little bit more courage. And let me just give you a little story here, that when the Fridays for Future went global for the first time, the 15th of March, Berlin was the biggest demonstration in the world. So Germany is, in a sense, the ground zero for the youth movement. I think it's fair to say. Immediately after that demonstration, what did Luisa Neubauer, who is Greta Thunberg in Germany, and Greta Thunberg, who was there, well, they jumped into an electric car and then went straight to where? To the Potsdam Institute, to spend half a day with the scientists, just to get the latest science update. They were not fearing paralysis. They just wanted to be filled up with the knowledge so they can be even more powerful in the exponential change. So I think in a way we don't have to be too, I don't think we have to be too locked in to the fear of standing by the evidence, so to say, even though I see the necessity of integrating.
Thank you, Johan. You wanted to speak?
Thank you very much. My name is Carlos Fuller. I'm from the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center and the lead negotiator for the Alliance of Small Island States in the UNFCCC process. I want to thank you for the presentations made today, which I think were really excellent and indeed brings the latest science to the forefront. And building on what you all have said already, the importance of getting this out to the general public and building on what the Chilean minister mentioned. At COP25, as the Substa Chair mentioned, we will have an Earth Information Day. This is where you can now speak to the negotiators, to the delegates, and get this message out to them. So I would hope that you would use this opportunity while you're here this week to see will you be able to go there and get these messages out there in a simple, concise manner that will get the policymakers to listen and to act on it. I recall earlier this year at the Petersburg Dialogue, the director of PIC made a fantastic presentation. And the Deputy Minister of France said, "And why did you not tell me this before?" She was hearing it for the first time. So obviously we think we're getting the message out, but we need to continue working on a continuous basis. So please, I hope you see you there at COP25. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the encouragement. On this side, we had Cynthia, we had Detlef.
Thank you. On the topic of how do we go forward for integration, really, that I think a lot that is the theme. And I think that we need to be open to new configurations. I'm going to give an example. It's related some to what Guido was saying about the food system. So Thelma presented the IPCC a special report on climate change and land. And in the food security chapter, we took a food system approach. And this had begun a little bit in AR5, but really we took it much further. We were able to, because literature was there, of course. But this food system approach actually is transformative, because rather than just focusing on agriculture, which there has been a tremendous amount of focus on agriculture, just agriculture is agriculture, we're now able to bring in the supply chains with the energy, the pre and post production, as well as the consumers, the food to fork. And that's one reason I think why there was a very positive response to the SRCCL circle, because it actually brought it all the way to the people and really made the connection to what people are eating. So I'm giving this as an example of the kind of this is like, how do we get to transformation? I think that's really the topic, and how can science contribute? And I think being creative in our configurations, I think can, and then funding really those, and that's why I would, just to get back to urban, this urban imperative is, I think, also very, very powerful to actually speed. We have to increase speed, and we have to scale up, and these kinds of new configurations are what we need. Thanks.
Thank you. Detlef, let me go to my side.
Yeah, I guess I have to be brief, and I guess you didn't really ask us the question what we do with $1 billion.
That's right. Otherwise, we don't have it right.
I mean, basically, I find this a very fascinating discussion that also brings kind of the problem to the forefront. We have heard it several times today. We have lost a full decade. If we actually would have acted 10 years ago, we would not be in that situation we are in right now. So I would not actually take the message back. I mean, you might be depressed, that's fine, but we have to act. And I think we are here all to understand that we really have to act. We need to start acting. And so then we have to go forward. Of course, we have to have a food security. We have to have security on water and many other things, but we have to act. And I think the message has to go out in whatever form. And I think the youth, in fact, is the first one who understood it. They are actually demanding, there's no planet B, really do something because it affects our futures. And in that sense, I would not tone it down. I would just tell the truth. This is what it is, and please go ahead, the politicians, but also every private person has to act. It is a huge transformation that we are heading towards, affecting everybody of us, and in fact requiring everybody of us, not just politicians.
Thank you. And on the other side, Maisa and Daya, in that order.
Thank you. I'm actually very happy that we are talking about transformation, and I really see it as an underlying threat of what we as scientists but also as members of the society have to be thinking and working on to actually address climate change. And I just wanted to share with you one of the things that we've been coming up with in this scientific committee that the Science Ministry set up and that I am coordinating back in Chile for COP25. And it's that there's actually, although we might not know how to actually do transformation, because I guess it's something that we just have to try to engage and do it, I see a very concrete opportunity, and is that all countries have to deliver by next year their long-term strategies. So up to now, we are all being very busy in thinking about our NDC, right, which is the sort of medium-term strategy or short or medium-term, but then we have to think about the long-term strategy, and it is clearly no way that we're going to do. I mean, neither the policymakers will be able to do that alone. We hope that there will be science-driven, right, at least, but as scientists, we are also increasingly realizing that it's not a discussion that will just have to occur between us and there. And I think I was on Friday on the climate march, and I felt a bit helpless. I thought like the energy that we need, it's here. It's in the youth. It was very strongly, I felt it in the indigenous people, and a lot less in myself, which doesn't mean that I'm going to go home and not do anything, but I am feeling compelled to definitely do things in a different way. And these thinking about long-term strategies, I think it's a very concrete opportunity to implement this transformation that we require to address climate change.
It needs science engagement indirectly. So, President of ISC, Daya, you are the last in this round, so you have a chance to do a $10 billion question for the International Science Council.
I'll send you a one-page proposal. Thanks, Pavel. I just wanted to make a very brief comment by way of picking up on comments earlier on 2 points. One has to do with the comments in relation to the importance of the social sciences. Absolutely endorse that, but I want to elaborate a little bit by indicating that the International Science Council was formed in July of 2018 from a merger of two organizations, ICSU, the International Council for Science, and the International Social Science Council, precisely in recognition of the fact that the kinds of global challenges that we face today typically cannot be addressed in a siloed way and typically require collaboration of scientists from across the spectrum of natural, including natural, social sciences, behavioral sciences as well. And in fact, some of our major projects are constructed in exactly that way. What we do is we're not a research organization, but we have the ability to mobilize, to convene And this is exactly what we are doing, particularly in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals. That's the first point. The second point that I want to pick up on concerned again, the very, very useful comments around communication, public engagement. Here again, if I can speak on behalf of the ISC, we frame this in relation to what we regard as the responsibilities of scientists. We have responsibilities with regard to research and the like, but very particularly also to communicate knowledge, findings to the broader public and to policymakers as well. And of course, there are huge challenges there, particularly with regard to the way in which one goes about doing this, engaging with the public on issues that can be very technical. But we have a responsibility to do that. Coming to climate change, in my remarks earlier, I spoke very briefly about the massive threats from individuals, organizations, governments and the like that are anti-scientific in their nature or pseudo-scientific. Put yourself in the position of members of the general public who, on the one hand, are taking stock of and coming to grips with what we're talking about here with regard to climate change, but at the same time have to contend with often very sophisticated pseudo-scientific approaches, climate denialism and the like. And there are many other examples. Vaccination is another one. So here, it's simply to strongly endorse the remarks that have been made around public engagement, which I think is not a nice to have, but which I think is a huge responsibility that we have to embrace as scientists. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was actually a very nice closure of our, I think, very good discussion. So let me now turn over to the chairs of the Science Advisory Group for the final session.
Thank you, Pavel, and thanks for this inspiring final discussion. I think that was a highly important part of this whole session. I studied meteorology in the early 80s, and then we knew that there's a secret called climate change, and the first IPCC report was published in '88, and since then the science community has been trying to knock all of the doors and push this information in the ears of decision makers, and finally what happened in Paris was that we have started seeing the impacts of climate change. So it was not only a theory, but it was something visible. And we also happened to have the right cocktail of heads of state, especially from Europe and USA and China and India, were following that we were able to sign the agreement. At the moment, the situation looks like that the process has been stagnated. So that's where we are today, and this kind of spirit that we had in 2015 doesn't exist. On the other hand, people, and especially young people, they are more and more aware of this, and we have seen these demonstrations, and I'm a little bit concerned that they are too horrified. So we have to be also a little bit careful with our messaging, and our target audience should be the decision makers, the policy makers, like the one who is sitting back there. He used to be a member of parliament, and we have also one minister left here. I think that you should be the ones to act, and of course the private investors should act. So that's the audience that we should target, and luckily also that audience seems to hear the message. Coming back to Pavel's question, where to place $100 billion US dollars or Swiss francs or euros, I'm coming from the country of where Santa Claus lives, and my plea to Santa Claus is that he would donate this 10 billion to such a process where we could give assistance to governments how to mitigate, because they are a little bit lost, and we have the situation is quite locked, like here in in your home country, in USA, it's a little bit this kind of black and white, and we should be able to provide positive means how to mitigate and also how to make politically acceptable decisions. We have seen. I'm living now in France, and I saw this Gilets jaunes, this Yellow Vest movement, rising when the petroleum price was proposed to be raised by a very small fraction. And that's the reality that the policymakers are facing. That it's not easy to make decisions, and once they do something which is not acceptable by the public, then the next government may be something of very different nature. So that's why the governments would need some support, and they would also need some positive arguments, and this kind of cost-benefit ratio of the mitigation would be needed. And of course, we should have a little bit longer perspective than the GDP next year in mind, but GDP in a couple of decades and so forth. So that's my plea for the decision makers. And my personal concern also is that I have been attending many COP meetings, and it's sometimes a question whether we have the right players there. It's often the ministries of environment who are quite marginal players in their countries, and the powerful ones are the ministers for finance and trade and industry, and how to engage them more in the business. That might be a key question. So I had the feeling that these COP meetings, they are gatherings of like-minded people where we come 20,000 people to one place, and we want to change the world, but the results are not so clear. And one might consider whether we should engage some other players in the country to be more successful in the COP process as well. So these were my concluding ideas, and I would like to give the final word, almost final word, to Lina, and thereafter we will hear from Ambassador Di Alba how are his words of wisdom. Lina first.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for a really wonderful discussion. A few points that I took away from the discussions, which I thought might also be useful for you, Ambassador Alba, were as follows. One is, of course, the fact that there was a great degree of expression of confidence on science, the fact that it is there, it has become more confident, and definitely the trust levels have gone up, but the fact that action is still, I won't say missing, but lagging far behind what science is calling for. And that is something that I think we need to understand much better on why this particular gap exists between what science is saying and what policymakers are responding to. The second point that I took away was around the fact that solutions do exist, are demonstrated, but the scale-up is not happening. So once again, the question comes up, why is that? Why are we not able to scale up the solutions that already exist? It's not so much a point of whether it is energy transitions or food. I think it's both, because while in one case we may have a lower level of understanding than in the other, but the fact is that that understanding is still not translating into the action that we are looking for, or into the scale-up that we are looking for. So I think we need to be very careful about identifying where we need to focus on, maybe at the cost. We need to do everything and do everything together. So I think that is the other, for me, that was an important takeaway. I would feel very uncomfortable if we were to frame our transformative changes in the context of politically feasible and culturally acceptable, because I think I heard at least 2 or 3 comments around that. Because if we start with that framing, I'm afraid that we may not bring about the kinds of transformative changes that are needed. So again, from a messaging perspective, I'm not sure if that would be desirable. There was a lot of discussion on the fear paralysis. Thank you, Minister, for raising that as well. And it seemed to me that whenever we talk about kind of an intractable problem or a very big scale problem, you need both the push and the pull. And in my mind, the science and the kind of fear that we are creating from the science, which needs to be told, and I agree with you totally on that, as is really creating that push to get out of our lethargy, push to get out of our inertia of inaction. Where we are possibly not doing enough is on the pull factor. So what are the alternates? I mean, do we have enough range of solutions that are available, that are scalable, replicable, etc., that would allow us to create that pull as well? So in the absence of that, then we risk possibly that fear paralysis that we are talking about. But this is definitely an area of focus. The 10 billion that Pavel is going to give all of us. A million, okay, all right, 10 million. Yes, to me, one of the things that really strikes me is the fact that governments are not yet equipped to get out of this siloed mentality, which all of us are talking about over here. We do not have the mechanisms by which most governments, I won't say all, but that would be wrong, are not able to look at things in an integrated, systemic fashion that we need to be able to do. So how is it? So we are talking about creating capacities at various levels, but governments is definitely one of them, and putting in place the mechanisms, the governance mechanisms that would allow us to do that is, I think, critically important. There was also a good degree of discussion on transformative versus incremental or marginal kinds of changes. And there was a very good example that was given by the Global Carbon Project on renewable energy. I think the fact that it is really nibbling away and working at the margins rather than really becoming the core of the energy system. And that again was useful. And finally, I would like to take up the point again that the minister raised about looking after the losers and ensuring that no one gets left behind, either in terms of actual losers or those who have an opportunity cost. And I think that's something, again, which has been a fairly sticky subject, and it seems, again, that this is something that we need to focus on. There are many other very good suggestions and comments that came in that cannot be captured, but thank you once again for all the inputs that have been provided.
So finally, I would like to give the floor to Ambassador De Alba, and he has been the man behind this whole climate summit, and he has been working day and night, and there's been heavy pressure on you, and I'm happy to see that you are still alive and even smiling. So, and we will see the final act tomorrow, and of course this is supposed to feed in the COP25 and the COP26 as well. So don't stop yet. But thanks for your effort so far, and I'd like to give the floor to you. Thanks.
Thank you very much to both of you, the co-chairs and of the Scientific Advisory Committee. And thank you very much, Lina, for the elements that you summarize at the end, because it allowed me to start with a few comments that explain much better what we are trying to achieve at this particular summit. Contrary to previous ones, on which the United Nations was focused on the COPs and how to support a process of negotiation between member states to reach to a certain level of understanding. And I will refer particularly to the last summit immediately before Paris, on which we were really trying to get the necessary political will for countries to go there, to commit, etc. This time, the purpose of the meeting is radically different. It will help the COPs, and I'm very happy to see the minister and the engagement of Chile on the follow-up of this summit in many ways, and specifically on science, because you have been working and creating your own groups. But our intention goes beyond that, and it addresses many of the problems that Lina was highlighting. The first one is that the system needs to fight its own, you put it in terms, I like it very much, the silo mentality. The system itself, the United Nations, cannot continue to work in silos. So we will start by making a huge effort to put this system in line. You will see that tomorrow by the end of the meeting, while the Secretary General make its conclusions, and he's going to be calling on the system to back up as a single unit the efforts of member states. The second big difference is that we are not focusing on negotiations. We are assuming that we do have already, probably not 100%, but we have a good understanding of what needs to be done and what each one needs to contribute to it. Now the question is to support implementation, to support those countries to do what they have committed to do, and to support them to go much higher, much faster than before, because science is telling us that we are lagging behind very much compared to what we had in mind. So this summit itself is an opportunity to bridge the barriers between the silos in the system and the silos or silos in the countries. That's why we are appealing for head of states to come and present plans that will give the necessary importance to the work that needs to be done by the ministers of finance. And once again, I welcome very much the initiative of Chile and Finland with the coalition of ministers of finance. What needs to do by other ministries, what needs to do by local authorities, what needs to do by local actors, including private sector, etc. So it's a totally different approach on which we need clarity on what needs to be done and who needs to be held accountable at each state of or step of the way. The intention is to produce, after this summit, a report that would be a substantive report. I don't want to qualify it as an analytical report, but it's going to be substantive, because we are not just going to have a summary of proposals, but rather an identification of how to deal with each of the initiatives and the proposals, what role the Secretary General himself can play in facilitating the implementation of those proposals, what role can be played by other agencies, what role can be played with the support of different entities. And your group is going to be critical. By organizing this event, trying to get a common understanding on how to move and how to reinforce the message that everything needs to be based on science, you are making a huge contribution. If I can talk about my own personal experience, and I go back to the preparation of Cancun, science was not so present at that moment, and even less so clearly recognized as the leading element for the actions of the government. We still have a gap, certainly, but at least there is already recognition that there is a gap that needs to be addressed. And that on itself, I think it is also a very positive development. I've been traveling quite extensively during this year, and I can tell you that no one has questioned several elements. The first, that everything needs to be based on scientific information. Nobody has questioned the need that we need transformative approaches. It's not just an incremental, it's not just a little better than we expected. It has to be very bold. Nobody has questioned the role of the Secretary General and the need to integrate effort from the UNFCCC, UNEP, UNDP, WHO, WMO, all the agencies. If we have this and we are able to put it together through this report of the Secretary General that will be presented in Santiago at the beginning of the COP, and we'll have a projection for the next COP in London, then we will have a solid program of work on which we should be able to make more progress. It may be the end of speeches, hopefully, as the Secretary requested at the beginning, and we may end up with a very consolidated plan, a plan that will certainly need more time than the one I'm talking about, but I don't want to talk about 2030, 2050. We know what needs to be done by then. I want to talk about what we need to do in the coming year, and I want to encourage you to help us in that process. So thank you very much again for your contribution, and let me finally also thank not only the co-chairs but all the members of the scientific advisory group. As you know, we have been working with them. We have given them several tasks along the year. They have been supporting the different coalitions. So it's a work of a full year, not only in the last few days and putting together this event, but engaging from the beginning. Let me also tell you that probably you don't know, but the idea of having an advisory scientific committee came directly from the Secretary General. He was the one requesting that group to be established, and then we undertook the task together to put it in place. But he personally thanks you very much. Thank you.
Great to meet you. And nice to know about the New York hydration. Yes. I'm going to go to New York. Yes, you are. Now I know what's
for the